Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Common Sense for the 21st Century by Roger Hallam. The subtitle, Only Nonviolent Rebellion Can Now Stop Climate Breakdown and Social Collapse. This is from the foreword. I was there for the past 20 years. Climate activism. It didn't work. We protested in our hundreds of millions. It didn't work. We raised billions to reach people and politicians. It didn't work. We signed countless online petitions. They didn't work. We looked to the United Nations to resolve the crisis. It didn't work. We trusted progressive politicians and their reforms. That didn't work. Al Gore had a big concert and a PR campaign. It didn't work. Countless NGOs, non-governmental organizations, did their best, and it didn't work. I worked with green NGO campaigns, champagne environmentalists, and lying politicians. I was wasting my time. I had a clue back in 2007 that there might be a fundamental flaw with the reformist approach, the problem with the political influence of the industrial billionaires like the Koch brothers and other fossil fuel bosses. It was another warm night in Los Angeles. I was invited to an exclusive event. A Tesla Roadster prototype was going to be shown to press and guests. We took turns riding around the block. I watched in amazement as the Tesla was at the end of the street in the blink of an eye, with barely a sound. I felt like a caveman seeing a television. Incredible. While I was working on a campaign in 2007, I had an idea for how to save the world with a massive music event and a huge fundraising effort led by celebrities to fund the biggest PR campaign to save the environment. It would be a huge global event, just like Live Aid. I sought out a prominent journalist at the Tesla event to tell about my scheme and bask in the glory of his praise. The journalist was Vijay Vithswaram from The Economist, now a life member of this Council on Foreign Relations. After listening carefully to my concept, he smiled and laughed. I was stunned. Laughter? How could I be so wrong? Vijay wasn't being cruel or unkind. He thought I was naive. He said, the fossil fuel industry has enough money to outspend any public relations campaign you might try by 100 times. He carried on talking, but I had stopped listening. I had my answer. He was right. Crestfallen, I sheepishly nodded and walked away. Over the next 12 years, I watched as fossil fuel companies used their vast financial capital to buy political parties, trick NGOs into fruitless schemes like the U.S. Cap and Trade Initiative, sow doubt about climate science in the public discourse, and slow policy reform to a snail's pace. Their strategy worked. As climate skepticism continued to spread, climate change mitigation dropped down voters' priorities. With Trump and Putin in power, it was over. I quit climate campaigning. Then I heard about Extinction Rebellion closing 5 bridges in London. And they closed central London in April 2019. This was something different. I met Roger Hallam and he explained his ideas for a radical plan to create real change. This included, first, tell the truth. Climate skepticism was pushed by the mainstream media, which spread doubt on climate science like a plague, leaving inaction in its wake. The scale of the crisis is being played down, and we must get the truth out. Second, nonviolent civil disobedience. We need to get arrested, tens of thousands of us, more. No more protests, no more petitions. Instead, nonviolent civil disobedience, lots of it, and on a large scale. Close down cities until the politicians take action, or until the people do. Third, universalism. In other words, the ecological and climate crisis should not be owned by any political ideology, culture, age, or gender. As Roger Hallam says, we all have a stake in the future. We should all be allowed to engage in action. I was convinced. We need a new approach to save ourselves and the planet. We need to spark a worldwide rebellion. We need some common sense for the 21st century. That foreword was written by, quote, anonymous climate activist. So this now is the introduction to the book. It is time to grow up and see the world as it is. There are some things which are undeniably real. There are some things we cannot change, and one of those is the law of physics. Ice melts when the temperature increases. Crops die in a drought. trees burn in forest fires. Because these things are real, we can also be certain about what the future holds. We are now heading into a period of extreme ecological collapse. Whether or not this leads to the extinction of the human species largely depends on whether revolutionary changes happen within our societies within the next decade. This is not a matter of ideology, but of simple math and physics. The United Nations has estimated that we need to reduce carbon emissions by half within a decade to have a 50% chance of avoiding a global catastrophe. Of course, this is likely to be an underestimate, as recent science shows permafrost melting 90 years earlier than forecasted and Himalayan glaciers melting twice as fast as expected. The book, Common Sense for the 21st Century, by Roger Hallam, the co-founder of the Extinction Rebellion. The subtitle, Only Nonviolent Rebellion Can Now Stop Climate Breakdown and Social Collapse.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Hey, raring to go. It's a Wednesday. It's a huge news day. On the war front, Russia has cut off gas supplies just in the last 24 hours to both Poland and Bulgaria. Poland gets about 60% of their natural gas from Russia. Bulgaria gets about 90%. Interestingly, both countries are saying, we can make it through. It's interesting how Europe is dealing with this. Of course, it's spring, too, and so the demand for natural gas is lower. But anyhow, I don't have a particular rant on that. I just wanted to share it with you. I think it's a major headline. This is a major change in Russian thinking on the war. Also, on the program today, Rand Paul hearts the Russianized libertarian version of the Laissez-Faire system. I'm going to start with that in just a minute. And in the first hour, did Kevin McCarthy and the Republican Party have a moment of moral clarity? And if so, what happened to it? And also in the first hour, here at the bottom of the hour, at 33 minutes past the hour, Professor Yascha Mounk is going to be with us. He's got a new book out called Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. And what he's talking about is basically answering the question, or even if it should be a question, is it possible for racially or religiously or culturally diverse democracies to function? And it's a fascinating question. How has that happened or not happened around the world? We'll get into that with Professor Yascha Mounk at the bottom of this hour. In the top of the second hour, Professor Richard Wolff will be with us, the professor of economics. And I'll be asking, how is Bitcoin not the same thing as the Dutch tulip mania? It seems to me like there's a lot of parallels. And also in the second hour, we're going to talk about this extraordinary reporting by Politico on the January 6th committee's bombshells hiding in plain sight, and more proof that the Republican Party wants theocracy, not democracy. In this case, proof coming from Marjorie Taylor Greene and a few others. I'll share that with you in the second hour of the program. In the third hour of our program, Dr. Fauci has now declared that we are out of the pandemic, a proclamation he made yesterday on PBS's NewsHour with Judy Woodruff. But he also says, no, I'm not going to go to the correspondents' dinner because it might be a super spreader event. My words, not his. He said he'd evaluated his personal risk. Same thing, right? So what's going on with the pandemic and the epidemic or whatever it is? We'll talk about that at the top of the third hour. And the majority, also in our third hour, a new poll from Politico, and You Vote, I believe it is. The majority of Republican voters are fine with Republican candidates who hold racist, homophobic, or anti-Semitic positions. Officially, who hold those positions. They're just fine with it. What does that say about the Republican Party? What does it say about America? What does it say about American politics? But I want to start today with my rant from HartmannReport.com. It's titled, Rand Paul Hearts the Russianized Libertarian Version of the Laissez-Faire System. And, there's a lot here. There's a lot to unpack here. And it starts out, Americans of all political persuasions, we're somewhere between horrified and mystified yesterday. Sean, can you pull this audio out of my computer? This is not the 360, it's my computer. This is an interchange. In fact, I think I played a clip of this yesterday afternoon, very briefly, between Rand Paul, Senator Rand Paul, the Republican senator from Kentucky, and Anthony Blinken, our Secretary of State.
My judgment is different. If you look at the countries that Russia has attacked over the last years, Georgia, leaving forces in Transnistria and Moldova, and then repeatedly Ukraine, these were countries that were not part of NATO. It has not attacked NATO countries for probably a very good reason.
You could also argue the countries they've attacked were part of Russia.
Well, that
we're part of the Soviet Union.
yes, and I firmly disagree with that proposition. It is the fundamental right of these countries to decide their own future and their own destiny.
And I'm not saying it's not, but I'm saying that the countries that have been attacked, Georgia and Ukraine, were part of the Soviet Union.
And that does
and
not
they
give
were
Russia
part
the
of
right
the
to attack.
Soviet Union since the 1920s.
But that does not give Russia the right to attack them on the
No
contrary.
one's saying it does, but it
They were
really has nothing
liberated
to do.
from being part of this empire by force.
So here you've got Rand Paul repeating Vladimir Putin's talking points. And, you know, a lot of people were going, what? Rand Paul loves Russia? He loves Putin? I don't think it's that simple. I mean, it is possible to build a case that Rand Paul is some kind of, you know, Putin lover. His grandson-in-law, who was convicted of campaign fraud for crimes he committed when he was running Rand Paul's campaign, and who Donald Trump then pardoned, was just again last month charged with a new case of campaign fraud, this time for funneling massive sums of Russian money into the 2016 campaigns. 3 weeks after Trump was groveling in front of Putin at Helsinki and attacking the U.S. intelligence services, Rand Paul secretly flew to Moscow on Donald Trump's behalf and hand-delivered a private note to Putin, which remains undisclosed to this day. Just a few weeks after the 8 Republican lawmakers spent the 4th of July in Moscow, that was Shelby, Daines, Hoeven, Johnson, Kennedy, Moran, Thune, and Granger. They spent that week of the 4th of July in Moscow. Just a couple weeks after that, Senator Paul made his own separate, private, secret trip to Moscow to meet, well, it wasn't secret actually, to meet with Russian lawmakers to discuss foreign relations. And at that meeting, one of the Russian lawmakers told him he could become a real man with a capital M if he would just help out Maria Butina, you know, the Russian spy who had an affair with a wealthy associate of Rand Paul's. So, you know, you could build this case, but it's an entirely circumstantial case, and I'm skeptical of it. Yeah, although, I mean, others have tried to build this case also. This is John McCain talking. Rand Paul, this was back in, I forget the year. This was back about 5 years ago or so, when Montenegro wanted to become part of NATO. And that requires U.S. approval, right? In fact, it requires the approval of 100% of all the NATO countries. It's a consensus organization. And Rand Paul, and so they called for a vote in the United States Senate because the Senate has to approve all treaties. NATO is a treaty. And they called for unanimous consent, and Rand Paul said, no, I don't consent. And then he walked out. And John McCain went nuts. Here's the clip.
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
I object.
Objection, sir.
So that's Rand Paul objecting.
Mr. President, I note
This is John McCain.
Kentucky leaving the floor without justification or any rationale for the.
I'm not hearing this in my ear.
just taken. That is really remarkable. That a senator blocking a treaty that is supported by the overwhelming number, perhaps.
I'm not hearing it. Nate's not hearing it.
Of his colleagues would come to the floor and object.
And walk away. And walk away. The only conclusion you can draw when he walks away is he has no argument to be made. He has no justification for his objection to having a small nation be part of NATO that is under assault from the Russians. So I repeat again, the senator from Kentucky is now working for Vladimir Putin.
So I'll repeat again. The senator from Kentucky is now working for Vladimir Putin. But I don't think that this is the key to the whole thing. I don't think that Rand Paul is doing this because he's working for Putin, John McCain's observations notwithstanding. I think that what's going on here is that Rand Paul is a follower, a devotee of this crackpot libertarian objectivist theory that was promoted by, what some believe was his namesake, Ayn Rand, and others. And libertarians don't believe in democracy. They will tell you that right up front. They'll if you ask them, they will tell you, an actual genuine libertarian, or Ayn Rand, an objectivist, will tell you that democracy is mob rule. Democracy, and I mean, Mike Lee tweeted this out on October 8th, 2 years ago. Democracy isn't the objective. Liberty, peace, and prosperity are. We want the human condition to flourish. Rank democracy can thwart that. So the argument that they make is that if people can choose what they want through referendums or elected representatives, they'll always bankrupt a nation. And they'll do this by voting for lots of free stuff for themselves. Therefore, nations had to put guardrails in place to prevent the rabble from voting themselves all that free stuff. The best of those guardrails is to allow unlimited political donations, campaign financing, from morbidly rich people who have proven their brilliance, their competence, and their wisdom by getting or inheriting riches, right? And if the people still demand free stuff and go around collecting signatures to raise the minimum wage or ban cruise ships from ecologically sensitive areas or let ex-felons vote, all things that happened in Florida, then you just do what Ron DeSantis did last July. He signed a law saying you can't do citizens' referendums anymore in Florida. Libertarians think they have this all figured out, but they're totally wrong. There has never been a country in the history of the world that was run along libertarian lines that didn't end up a dictatorship. This is what's going on in Russia right now. We sent the Chicago boys back in the late 90s over to Russia, or in the early 90s, over to Russia to help them privatize their system. And so now you've got, a couple of Russian oligarchs who are supplying all the military, and you've got Russian soldiers going into battle with cardboard bulletproof vests. I mean, I'm not making that up. It's true. And this is what happens. And you've got, Putin running the country like a dictator. I think this is the source of Rand Paul's real love, apparent love for Putin and Russia. It's not a romantic love for Putin. It's not even admiration for Putin. It's brotherhood with Putin. It's a fraternal love. He sees Putin as a guy who's running the country the way that Rand Paul thinks America should be run. He loves this Russianized. Now, he would do it slightly differently here in the United States. We'd use different language and all these kind of things. But he loves this Russianized libertarian version of laissez-faire economics and politics. And like his father, he has spent his entire career trying to impose that libertarian vision on America. I mean, the fact is, no country in the world has ever failed because their people voted themselves too much free stuff. And no country in the world has ever succeeded as a libertarian country. Libertarianism and democracy are incompatible with each other. And Rand Paul understands that, which is why he's promoting Russia and Russia's interests, in my humble opinion. So, anyhow, after the break, I want to talk to you about, or share with you my thoughts on all these tapes that are coming out with Kevin McCarthy basically trash-talking Republicans back right after January 6th. Stick around. We'll talk about that in just a minute.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
A lot going on in the world today. Kevin McCarthy saying the Republican lawmakers could be causing, violence. And welcome back. Let's see who's... there we go. Jason in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Hey, Jason, thanks for calling this morning. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom.
Hey.
Let me get a connection.
You are
here.
live and on the air here, Jason. What's on your mind?
Hello, Tom.
Yeah, I'm going to have to put Jason on hold here and let Joyce work it out. So... Let me just go back to expanding on the whole libertarian thing, because this is, I think this is a really critical point that most Americans don't get. There was this Scottish economist who is quoted. He actually didn't say this stuff, but he is quoted as, and it's an article of faith among libertarians, that this Scottish philosopher or economist from the last century, or actually, the late 18th century, or late 19th century, saying that there has never been a successful democracy in the world because or that has lasted more than 200 years because the people will always vote themselves free stuff, and then with all that free stuff, they will destroy the country. They'll bankrupt the country. As I said, it's never happened that way. And he was writing, the guy who wrote this was in the 50s. The guy who wrote it was actually a right-winger, and he just kind of put words in this economist's mouth. And it was like the 200th anniversary of the United States. So it was it must have been the 70s. And, it was just like weird stuff. This is their belief system. It's just very straightforward. Rob in West Palm Beach, Florida. Hey, Rob, thanks for watching us on Free Speech. What's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, I always like to listen to two sides of every story. I'm an open-minded guy. Always like that. But how can you say, I heard you say this, and I watch your show, and I heard you say about, I don't know, maybe it was 3 to 4 days ago, that you thought the economy was the best it's ever been at this point in time.
I said unemployment is lower than it has ever been. The economy is growing at a faster rate than it has in the history of the United States. That doesn't necessarily mean everything's wonderful. We've got a big problem with inflation, which is largely the result of two things. Number one, the end of the pandemic. All this pent-up demand is unleashed, just like after World War II. And number two, you've got all these supply chain problems. Well, and number three, you've got Saudi Arabia refusing to raise their oil production back to where it was when Donald Trump negotiated the 2.2 million barrel a day cut back in 2020. That cut is still in place. And Saudi Arabia has just thrown in completely with the Trump family. They gave Jared Kushner $2 billion. And they're trying to damage Joe Biden right now by refusing to raise oil production. That's my take, Rob.
But Tom, why would we even need to ask the Saudis for oil when we could pump enough oil to provide for this country?
Because the price of oil is an international price of oil. When there is a shortage of oil worldwide, the price of oil goes up, and the oil producers in the United States, who are selling into the United States, set their price at that international price. And the only way you can do anything about that is to pass a law giving the president the power to basically take on the oil companies. And nobody wants to do that. Nobody has the political will to do that. Rob, great question. Thank you for the call. We'll be right back. It's 22 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. I'll be back with you in 60 seconds after I just read a quick commercial over on the other side of the program. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. The recent killing of a young black man in Michigan, Patrick Loyola, who was, the police officer was sitting on his back and put a gun right to the back of his head and shot him, is just the latest example of police killing people out of traffic stops, and predominantly black people. 28% of the people who are killed in traffic stops are black, but African Americans are only 13% of our population. Police in the United States have killed nearly 600 people during traffic stops since 2017. Mapping Police Violence is the nonprofit that's been doing the work on this. About 10% just this year, about 10% of the 1,100 people killed by police this year have been killed at traffic stops. Dante Wright, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, we know their names and we know their stories, but we're not doing enough to get this under control. Other countries tend not to have this problem. We need to do something now. There's a video about it over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. All right, back to my rant here. These tapes of Kevin McCarthy, I've been watching this, listening to it because there's no video that goes along with it. But they're playing them on television all the time. And this was in the 4 or 5 days immediately after January 6th. And McCarthy and other Republicans are getting together on the phone, and they're saying, and this was the leadership of the Republican Party, apparently, and they're saying, what are we going to do? I mean, we've got a bunch of followers of Donald Trump who just tried to murder the vice president and the Speaker of the House. They probably would have killed us if the Capitol Police hadn't kept them out of the chamber. And now you've got Republicans out there like Paul Gosar and Mo Brooks who are inciting this, and they're continuing to incite it, and they're going to get somebody else killed. Now, you know, there's this whole battle going on right now on the right, by and large, and it's playing out in Fox News and on right-wing talk radio as we speak, about whether McCarthy was a toady of the Democrats, or whether he was woke, or I mean, this is basically the charge that Tucker Carlson made the night before last. Or if, he just had a moment, a slip or whatever. What I think happened, and I'm quite clear about this, is that they all understood how truly horrible what happened on January 6th was, how terrible for our democracy Donald Trump was. They had this moment of clarity. They saw it as a crime and a danger to democracy itself. And for several days, they were concerned with trying to message about, cleaning this up. And then Donald Trump got to them, and they wimped out. This is exactly what happened in Germany as Hitler was rising to power in 1933. This is exactly what happened. The conservative parties, Bismarck and his buddies, the German version of the Republican Party, hated Hitler. And they thought they could control him. And so ultimately they embraced him after they trash-talked him. And the same thing is happening with Trump right now. And so, I think what this tells us is that these guys knew how wrong this was. They were willing to say it out loud for 4 or 5 days, which means today they still know how wrong it is, but they've decided to lie about it. They've decided to change their position to be more Trump-friendly. This does not typically end well.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be back with Yascha, Mounk, and the great experiment, why diverse democracies fall apart and how they can endure, in just a moment.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club
Hey, it's
is
Thom Hartmann. We're reading from A Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right in today's Thom Hartmann University Book Club. This is from Chapter 11, page 271. The official opening of the 112th Congress took place on January 5th, 2011, when Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, handed off an oversized ceremonial gavel to her successor, John Boehner. But a new era of ultra-conservative billionaire influence had already begun. Before the public swearing-in ceremony got underway, David Koch, whose donor network had spent at least $130.7 million on winning a Republican majority, was in the new Speaker-to-be's office, ornate office, chatting amiably with his staff. The People's House was under new management, and critics would suggest new ownership. While Koch was a very public presence on the Capitol, his political adjutant, Tim Phillips, the president of Americans for Prosperity, was deep in the inner sanctum of the congressional committee that mattered most to the bottom line of Koch Industries. Phillips's most important destination that day was the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which under the new Republican majority had now increased its power to block President Obama's environmental agenda in Congress. The committee could bury progress on climate change and harass the EPA for the foreseeable future. And then just jumping through a little anecdote about Lee Fong and David Koch, they continue. In Plutocrats, the rise of the new global super-rich and the fall of everyone else, journalist Krista Freeland describes how those with massive financial resources almost universally use them to secure politics and policies beneficial to their interests, often at the expense of the less well-off. In the United States, a number of studies have shown that in recent years, this tendency has distorted politics in very specific ways. In a study he conducted for the nonpartisan Sunlight Foundation, the political scientist Lee Drutman found that increasingly concentrated wealth in America resulted in more polarization and extremism, especially on the right. Very rich benefactors in the Republican Party were far more opposed to taxes and regulations than the rest of the country. He discovered the more Republicans depend upon 1% of the 1% donors, the more conservative they tend to be. The 112th Congress soon unfolded as a case study of what David Frum, an advisor to the former President George W. Bush, described as the growing and, in his view, destructive influence of the Republican Party's radical rich. The radicalization of the party's donor base, he observed, has propelled the party to advocate policies that were more extreme than anything since Barry Goldwater and his 1964 presidential campaign. It also led Republicans in Congress to try tactics they would never have dared use before, end quote. Hard data supported this. Harvard's Theta Scup poll found that the House took the biggest leap to the far right since political scientists began recording quantitative measurements of legislators' positions. There was no better example than the Koch's newly won influence over the House Energy and Commerce Committee. In the previous Congress, the panel had been chaired by Henry Waxman, a liberal Democrat from California, who had quarterbacked the House's successful passage of the cap and trade bill, only to see it die in the Senate. Now the new Republican leadership stocked the committee with oil industry advocates, many of whom owed huge campaign debts to the Kochs. Koch Industries PAC was the single largest oil and gas industry donor to members of the panel, outspending even ExxonMobil. It had donated to 22 of the committee's 31 Republican members and 5 of its Democratic members, too. In addition, 5 out of the 6 Republican freshmen on the committee had received outside support from Americans for Prosperity. Meanwhile, many of the new committee members had signed an unusual pledge swearing fealty to the Koch's agenda. They promised to vote against any kind of carbon tax unless it was offset by comparable spending cuts, an unlikely scenario. The no climate tax pledge was invented by Americans for Prosperity in 2008, when the Supreme Court cleared the way for the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases as it does other pollutants. The Koch's pledge was modeled on the enormously successful one that the anti-tax crusader Grover Norquist had used to intimidate Republican lawmakers from raising taxes. But in this instance, it served not a cause so much as a company. By the start of the legislative session in 2011, fully 156 members of Congress had signed the Koch brothers' no climate tax pledge. Many returning members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee had already taken the pledge, and of the 12 new Republicans on the panel, 9 were signatories, including 5 of the 6 freshmen. A prime example of the symbiotic relationship between the Kochs and the committee was Morgan Griffith, who had defeated Rick Boucher in the district that represented Saltville, Virginia, and was among the new wave of appointees to the Energy and Commerce Committee who were openly indebted to the Koch brothers for their seats. Americans for Prosperity operatives were guests of honor at a victory rally soon after the election, at which Griffith gushed, quote, "I'm just thankful that y'all helped me out in so many ways," end quote. The Koch's investment soon paid off. Once in office, Griffith became an outspoken skeptic of mainstream climate science, drawing national ridicule for lecturing scientific experts as they testified before Congress that they needed to consider the possibility that Mesopotamia and the Vikings owed their success to global warming, and the melting ice caps on Mars showed that humans were not its cause on Earth. Congressman Griffith became a lead player in the House Republicans' war on the EPA, demanding that the agency be reined in. Within a month after he took office, he and other House Republicans gutted the EPA budget by a punishing 27%. Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right by Jane Mayer.
Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. "34 minutes past the hour." On the line with us is Professor Yascha Mounk. He's a professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University, the founder of Persuasion, contributor to The Atlantic, and a senior fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. But most consequentially for our conversation today, he's the author of an extraordinary new book, The Great Experiment: Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. YaschaMounk.com, YASCHAMOUNK.com is his website. Yascha Mounk with an underscore between the two words is his Twitter handle. Professor Mounk, welcome to the program. I read your book. 9 out of 10 times I just don't have the time to read the books of people who are going to be guests on our program. We got it in here. I did a book report on it, and I was so fascinated by it, I took it home and read it. And I think this is like one of the most important issues that people can be discussing anywhere in the world right now. I was in South Sudan around the time that they separated from Sudan when they had their referendum, because Sudan to the north was brown-skinned Arabs who were raiding the black-skinned non-Muslims in South Sudan and taking them as slaves. I mean, it was just insane. We were there as they were repatriating slaves, and this question of can diverse democracies function, can diverse countries even survive, is a huge one. Can you start out by talking about what a diverse democracy is and what the history of them might be?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on. Look, so, most countries think of themselves as diverse in some important ways. In Europe for centuries, people waged wars against each other over minor doctrinal differences within Protestantism or between Protestants and Catholics. But nevertheless, we can sort of look at differences in magnitude. And there are some countries today that are relatively homogeneous, like Japan or like Bulgaria. And there's others like the United States, like India, like much of Western Europe, like Britain and Australia, which have a huge number of different ethnic and religious groups within them. And looking at history for my book, I show that a lot of the times these societies have gone deeply wrong, that they've suffered from extreme injustices, that they've fallen apart into forms of war and civil war and ethnic cleansing and genocide. And there's deep reasons for that. And part of that is our human nature. We are deeply groupish. We have this instinct to form groups, often to treat members in that group very morally, very altruistically, but also often to discriminate in terrible ways against others. And this can be triggered in all kinds of different ways, along all kinds of different ethnic and religious and racial lines, with racial classifications that work in very different ways at different times. But the basic mechanism is the same. And so what we're trying to do today, which is to build these ethnically and religiously diverse democracies that actually treat their members as true equals, is unprecedented. It's really difficult, but I think it can succeed.
This is the story. You mentioned India, for example. Right now, Modi is he's successfully increasing his power, his political power, by basically trashing Muslims. You've got horrible ethnic battles going on in India right now. Here in the United States, you've got Donald Trump and large chunks of the Republican Party committed to trashing black people or gay people or pick your minority, brown-skinned immigrants from south of the border. You've got the same problem in Brexit. There was a number of studies done back before that vote showing that many of the pro-Brexit voters were people who were opposed to people of different ethnicities coming to Great Britain to work. Has there ever been, long-term, a successful, pluralistic, genuinely diverse democracy anywhere in the world?
No. So one of the things that I tried to do in writing this book is to say, hey, if I find some great example of a country that really works wonderfully, I could go and spend some time there. That sounds like fun. And then I could, describe the model and say we should emulate it. But that doesn't really exist. We have lots of societies that have gone badly wrong. We don't have a lot of inspiring examples. But for me, when you start with naivety and with optimism about this project, when you say it should be really easy to get along, then you end up looking at the current state of American society and saying it's terrible. And so there's no hope, because how can we fail this easy undertaking? The future must be worse. If you start with a realistic appreciation of some of the mechanisms that have always driven humans to form these groups and discriminate in favor of the in-group, of the much more extreme ways in which other societies and our own society in the past have gone wrong, then you can look back at the present and say we've actually made real progress in the last few decades. We are a much more tolerant society than we were 100 or 50 or even 25 years ago. we are seeing real socioeconomic progress of immigrants and of minority groups. And we can build on some of our fundamental principles, on the basic principles of the American Republic, of liberal democracy, in order to make it succeed. So in a strange way, the violent history of diverse societies tells us mistakes, but it can also inspire pride in some of the things we've accomplished and hope to keep making progress in the coming decades.
This seems to be as I mentioned a moment ago, it seems to be the primary dividing line, the primary schism in American society is, there are in-groups that the law protects but does not bind, and there are out-groups that the law binds but does not protect. And historically, that's been, white people versus everybody else, or straight people versus everybody else in terms of gender, and straight men, in fact, for that matter. And from reading your book, one of the things that really troubled me was the idea that when democracies are stressed, these really bubble to the surface, these differences, and they become much bigger. They become magnified. How can American society, or any society for that matter, I mean, we're seeing these challenges in Israel, we're seeing them in South Africa, we're seeing them in Great Britain, we're seeing them, we just saw them in the French election, for goodness sakes. A large part of that was about, oh my God, there are Muslims among us. What are the specifics that a democracy can embrace or do? I mean, is this a matter of messaging? Is it a matter of law? American schools, for example, right now are more segregated than they were in 1965. This is not the function of law as much as it is, choice. So what do we do?
Well, so, a couple of points. The first is that I think it's actually really dangerous, and it's wrong to think of America as fundamentally pitting whites versus people of color. There's very few things today that liberals and Republicans, Democrats and conservatives agree on. But one of them is this idea of a rising demographic majority for Democrats. That's what drives a lot of the demographic panic on the right. A lot of the people who think if we continue to have immigration, if we allow people who are not white to vote in equal measure at the polls, then Democrats are always going to win, and so that's going to be terrible, according to them. It's also what drives some triumphalism on the left. But that's not actually how most people think of themselves. The identity of Latinos, the identity of a rapidly growing number of mixed-race people in the country, the identity of Asian Americans is much more complicated than that. Even among African Americans, there's interesting divisions between people who've been here for a very long time, whose ancestors were enslaved, and people who are descended from more recent immigrants from Kenya and Nigeria and other places. And when you look at our politics, you see that that's not what voting behavior is actually like. So in 2020, the only reason why Donald Trump was competitive at the election is that he significantly increased his share of the vote among every non-white voting group, including African Americans and Asian Americans and especially Latinos. And the only reason why Joe Biden is the legitimately elected 46th president of the United States is that he significantly increased his share of the vote among white voters relative to Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. So I actually think one of the important things is to resist this narrative that American reality or that America's future is going to be this battle between whites and people of color. That is not how most people think of themselves. It is not the kind of society we should create. And I certainly don't want to live in a society where I can walk down the street and guess who you vote for by the color of his skin, by the way you'd have to vote for the other political party that you probably do.
This morning, Politico just published a new poll by Morning Consult where they asked if a candidate is accused of blank, is it a major problem? Domestic violence, 81% of Democrats said, yes, that's a major problem, only 67% of Republicans. But then you get into these cleavage points, racism, 80%, Democrats would say that's disqualifying, 80%. Only 38% of Republicans say being a racist disqualifies you from being a Republican candidate.
No, I'm sorry, but that's just wrong. They're not saying that being a racist does disqualify you. They're saying that being accused of being a racist doesn't
They say
disqualify
if the candidate
you.
makes racist remarks, that doesn't disqualify.
Well, if accused of having made racist remarks.
No, has made. Oh, is accused of. You're right. I'm sorry. That's the actual language.
And so, sorry, but this is the thought of my friends on the left. If you go around, like some of our best-selling authors, saying that every person is racist, this is literally what Robin DiAngelo, says that everybody is racist, every white person is racist, then what you do is to cheapen the term. And when a lot of our fellow citizens say, hey, when somebody's accused of racism, who knows what they mean, I'm going to tune out. Racism is the worst sin, one of the very worst sins of which humans are capable. And to cheapen the term by saying everybody is racist, you have exactly the effect of no longer being able to exclude people who truly are racist. So sorry, but I think our friends on the left side of the aisle are partially to blame for that. And this poll means something slightly different than the headline might suggest.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. So do we get there? I mean, the there presumably that we're all trying to get to is a society that is essentially blind to color or gender, to these points of cleavage. Do I have that right? Anti-Semitism, homophobia, racism? Well,
yes and no. So people will always be groupish. They'll always give big importance to the groups that they're from. Right. And that's perfectly fine. That's one of the things that makes America great, that we have this real diversity. And of course, we need to be very aware of the way in which some of those cleavages structure our society today. There is racist and other anti-Semitic, other injustice in the United States today. And we have to describe those clearly. I do think that we want to build a society in which some of those cleavages become less important than they are today, in part because they structure our lives less. And we certainly want a society in which people might still be very proud of their cultural origins, of their religion, perhaps also of their ethnicity to some extent. They'll also feel that they have a real commonality with Americans who come from different groups, that there's something that we share as American citizens and a real mutual solidarity that we've been able to build.
There are some who suggest that as societies go through changes, that this is, it goes back to like Strauss and Howe's work back in the 90s, that as societies go through changes, there's like this crisis moment. It's like giving birth. Everything seems to be falling apart, but in fact, a new order is being birthed. And we just have a minute here before we're going to hit a hard break. Is that where we're at right now? Are we in one of these positive turning points, even though it seems so negative, or are we actually in a crisis here in the United States and around the world? And like I said, in France, et cetera.
Well, I think it's too early to tell. Well, it depends on the actions that we take. It depends on the decisions we make. It depends on the politicians we elect as well. Right. But I do think that actually when you step away from the political level and look at some of the changes in the heart of society over the last decades, they're positive. When you step away a little bit and look at, for example, the hugely increased acceptance of gay people in this country, when you look at the hugely increased acceptance of something like interracial marriage, which a majority of Americans opposed 30 years ago, when you look at the rapid socioeconomic mobility for basically every ethnic minority groups, as well as for the immigrants who are coming into our country, there is real progress we've made, and we should also be aware of that.
It's a remarkable book. It's titled The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure by Professor Yascha Mounk. Check it out. It's really great. Professor, thanks so much for dropping by and talking with us today.
Thank you so much.
Fascinating conversation. We'll be right back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Can America become a truly functioning and truly diverse society? We're definitely not there yet. And welcome back. Let's see here. James in Spokane, Washington. Hey, James, what's on your mind today?
Tom, first, good day to you, sir. Great day it is.
Back at you.
I want to say something first about the war on drugs, because I think we lose sight of the fact that it's been going on for 100 years. And this is probably the most deteriorating factor in our society. It's probably the greatest restriction to our ever becoming democracy. And there's half the people or more in jail for victimless crimes.
Yeah, this is Harry Anslinger's legacy, and he started it basically not because he was concerned about drugs, but because he saw it as a weapon that could be used against black people. And
this is 100
Hispanics.
years now.
Yeah.
This is 100 years. It's
I know.
unfathomable. It's almost unbelievable.
Yeah.
But concerning the war in Ukraine, Tom, there's people who have a little slightly different view than you have on what's going on there. And I'm not saying me. I'm just saying.
I'm sure.
Richard Wolff, for instance, has a different take on it. Mm-hmm. And he was talking to Chris Hedges yesterday on Free Speech Television, on Chris Hedges' show. And they definitely have an altered perspective from what you're presenting. I think you might ask one of them about that.
Okay. Thanks for the advice, James. Mark in Lexington, North Carolina. Hey, Mark, what's on your mind?
Good afternoon, Tom. How are you?
I'm well. What's up?
I need to speak very fast because I'm trying to cover a lot of subjects. Do you believe McCarthy and Scalise will be eaten alive, or do you think McCarthy's already made peace with Donald Trump? This will all
I think it's probably going to be the latter, but increasingly in Trump world, which is now Republican world, McCarthy is being seen as a rhino. He's not sufficiently loyal. Oh my God! For a moment, he had 3 or 4 days there where he actually took this stuff seriously.
Yeah, it was amazing, and then he goes down and kisses the ring of Donald Trump. It was just. I guess he knew that was going to come out. Yep. But, you got Tucker Carlson and Matt Gaetz wanting to crucify him over this. Yep. And I'm just wondering, is this going to...
The thing to keep an eye on, Mark, is if the Republicans take the House of Representatives, and even if they don't, frankly, the Republicans are going to vote for their leadership in January of next year, at the beginning of the new year. And... if there is a serious challenge to McCarthy's sort of billionaire and corporate-friendly leadership and wanting to replace that with the Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene type of Donald Trump wackadoodle leadership, if that's successful, that's the end of the Republican Party, in my opinion.
There's one other thing I wanted to bring up, and that is history repeats itself, and I'm going to be very quick on this. In 1938, Adolf Hitler invaded the Sudetenland, and that was part of Czechoslovakia, and it was a German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia on the principle that they were being persecuted. Okay? The generals of the military agreed if this brought war, they would take down Hitler. They would also take down the SS. They had the entire plan planned out. Of course, Chamberlain flew in and made everything all right again. So they didn't do it. They thought, well.
So your question, real quick, Mark, because we're gonna get cut off here in just a second.
I just believe that Putin thought the same thing with Ukraine, and it backfired.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right. He has been following Hitler's Poland playbook, and it's blowing up in his face. I'm with you, Mark. Thank you. Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann Program. I don't know if you caught this, but there was a piece of legislation before the House of Representatives that explicitly required the U.S. State Department to preserve any evidence of war crimes committed by the Russian forces in Ukraine, to gather reports of it, to preserve it, presumably in anticipation of some sort of a war crimes prosecution. And for reasons I can't quite figure out, maybe you have an idea, 6 Republicans voted against this. No, we don't want the war crimes of the Putin administration to be. Thomas Massie from Kentucky, Scott Perry from Pennsylvania, Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, Warren Davidson from Ohio, Andy Biggs from Arizona, and Paul Gosar from Arizona. I'm scratching my head here. Why would these 6 Republican politicians not want us to preserve the war crimes evidence? There's a video about this that you can see over at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. 54 minutes past the hour, picking up your calls. So much to talk about, right? Morris in Long Beach, California. Morris, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on Yascha Mounk's thoughts.
Oh, not a problem. Listen, anyone that breathes American air is not automatically a racist, but anyone that breathes American air is automatically race conscious. We're all conscientious of it.
Yes.
Going back to scholars, Aristotle, when he said God made man in his image, and everybody knows that God is not a Negro, so the Negro is not a man. And then, of course, Thomas Jefferson said that black people were odorous. You've got to go back and see how we've all been trained, conditioned, and programmed. That's why we are race conscious. But we're not all active in trying to decimate other people because they're different. And that's where the racist, comes in, as opposed to being conscious of the differences. That's all I want to say.
Well, okay, yeah, you said it very well, and I completely agree. And I think it's a really important point to make, and that's where we need to get to. We can be conscious of each other's differences, but that doesn't mean that we hate on each other. It doesn't mean we try to destroy each other. It doesn't mean we try to, disempower or even kill each other, which is where we've been. So well said, Morris. Rachel in Needham, Massachusetts. Hey, Rachel, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Good morning. Good afternoon. I'm calling because I'd like to put my voice out there in regards to more about yesterday and the day before. My belief is that we need to start the January 6th committee, public committee meetings, whatever you want to say.
Yeah, the hearings, yeah.
The hearings, thank you so much.
I think they're going to wait until after the war is not the main headline, because competing with that war is really a challenge.
Well, I don't know if we have to compete with it, but, I mean, right now they're starting to leak things, right?
Yeah.
Things are starting to come out slowly. So they're already starting the process, and the war is here. So who knows what they know already, right? Because we just got Trevor Reed out.
Right.
So something's going on behind the scenes.
Well, that started before the Ukraine war. That negotiation's been going on for a year.
That is a good point. But if we start the committees now, or at least start talking about them and getting them up and running, even before the war is over, maybe a little, it kind of just slowly ramping up.
They've pretty much announced that they're going to do it in June, Rachel.
The other side is bombarding media all the time. So that's what we need to do.
Yeah.
We need in game. We need to beat them at the same game.
I get it, and I agree with you, and I think that to an extent, as you correctly point out, Rachel, that's what they're doing with leaks right now, or with public disclosures. A lot of this is not even leaks. It's just like, hey, look at what we found. Here's the audio. Amazing time. We will be back with Professor Richard Wolff on the other side of this break, and Bitcoin. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, How the Death of Privacy and the Rise of Surveillance Threaten Us and Our Democracy by Thom Hartmann. More information at all book outlets. Wild Alaskan Company, 100% sustainable wild-caught seafood delivered right to your door. More info at wildalaskancompany.com/Tom. Cozy Earth, better sleep, better you. More info at CozyEarth.com, promo code TOM. The latest views and opinions from U.S. politics and other fascinating subjects too, including cutting-edge science reports at HartmannReport.com. And Dinovite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at Dinovite.com.
We take life back!
book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Stokely, A Life by Peniel E. Joseph. This is from the preface. Stokely Carmichael is a troubling icon of America's civil rights years. His Black Power call became a national Rorschach test. Whereas many blacks viewed it as righteous, many whites saw violent foreboding. Newspapers brooded over Carmichael's words, quickly forming a consensus that judged the slogan to be at best intemperate and at worst a blatant call for anti-white violence and reverse racism. In 1966, Black Power reverberated around the world, galvanizing blacks, outraging whites, and inspiring a cross-section of ethnic and racial minorities. In 1969, Carmichael left the United States for Conakry, Guinea, where he reinvented himself as a roving Pan-Africanist organizer and professional revolutionary. For the next 30 years, he remained an energetic dissident, a throwback to the heady years of the 1960s. Carmichael turned the quest for black political power into his life's work. His faith in a style of politics many considered anachronistic came out of the same tenacity and stubbornness that once made him one of the most effective and controversial activists of his generation. These same qualities, however, limited Carmichael's efforts as a Pan-Africanist political mobilizer. Before leaving America, Stokely resigned as Black Power's glamorous enfant terrible. Telegenic, brash, equal parts angry and gregarious. Whether dressed in three-piece suits, leather jackets, sharecroppers' overhauls, or African dashikis, Carmichael became to represent the era's multifaceted identity. A hipster hero whose easy grace allowed him to consort effortlessly with both the dignified and the damned. The name Stokely Carmichael first came into my consciousness when I was a young boy coming of age in New York City. As the proud son of a Haitian mother who belonged to local 1199 Hospital Workers Union, part of SEIU, I grew up hearing stories of how civil rights activists, Black Power revolutionaries, Pan-Africanist freedom fighters, and trade unionists helped to shape a new world in America and beyond. By the time I was in elementary school, I was on my first picket line, accompanying my mother in support of an 1199 strike. Both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King supported 1199 during the 1960s. Stokely Carmichael's political importance came into sharper focus when I was in junior high after the premiere of the landmark PBS documentary series Eyes on the Prize, which featured the 24-year-old Carmichael's fiery Black Power speech and rightly characterized Stokely as his generation's heir to Malcolm X. Over the course of a decade of research on Carmichael, I would come to understand him as that and much more. Carmichael's youth, casual dress, and charisma made him an easily identifiable hero, one whose quick smile and passionate speeches left an indelible impression. An adopted son of the South by way of Trinidad, the Bronx, and Harlem, Stokely adapted while transforming whatever environment he encountered. As a native New Yorker growing up in the city's tense racial climate of the 1980s, I found Carmichael's survival instincts appealing. As a young graduate student in Philadelphia, I had the opportunity to hear him speak and briefly met him afterward. He encouraged me to stay committed to the Black freedom movement, a struggle he defined as infinite. With his flowing African robes, gray hair, and white beard, he looked like a prince. And he had changed his name. He was no longer Stokely Carmichael. As Malcolm Little had become Malcolm X and later El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, Stokely had become Kwame Ture. It was a name that paid homage to his two African heroes, men who had been the first presidents of their countries, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Guinea's Sekou Touré. Kwame Ture spelled the Guinean's name not as the French did, as white Europeans did, but as Arabs and Muslims did. Sekou Touré, S-E-K-U-T-U-R-E. As a college student, Carmichael helped transform America by organizing sit-ins, demonstrations, and voter registrations during the Civil Rights Movement's heroic years, a period that roughly encompasses the decade between the 1954 Brown v. Board Supreme Court decision, desegregation decision, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and has become enshrined in public memory through national holidays, films, commemorations, and monuments. Carmichael's deep sense of justice contributed to his evolution into Kwame Ture, the Pan-Africanist revolutionary and anti-capitalist organizer who moved to West Africa and remained tenacious in the face of searing political setbacks. Carmichael ultimately judged America incapable of creating the free and just world he had struggled for as a young man. But despite living in Africa for the final 30 years of his life, Carmichael's legendary stature as a black power activist lingered even if many ignored his lasting contributions to civil rights struggles that included a bruising quest for the vote in the Deep South. Although today largely forgotten, Stokely Carmichael remains one of the protean figures of the 20th century, a revolutionary who passionately believed in self-defense and armed rebellion, even as he revered nonviolence. The book Stokely, A Life, by Peniel L. Joseph.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to Hour 2 of the Thom Hartmann Program. On the line with us, our old buddy, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, the co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books. His latest, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. Democracyatwork.info, rdwolff.com, and Prof. Wolff on Twitter. Professor Wolff, welcome back. I'm wondering, I've been watching this whole Bitcoin thing for a while now, ever since it kind of appeared on the scene. And it strikes me that what we're looking at is something very similar to the Dutch tulip mania, where something that was not a currency functionally became a currency as well as a commodity. It could be produced. It could be, and marketed. It could be produced in large numbers, in fact. And then the bubble burst. How is Bitcoin not the same thing as the Dutch tulip mania? And maybe you need to, even if your thinking runs along my lines, or even if it's the exact opposite, we should probably explain to people what the Dutch tulip mania was.
Yes, back early in the 18th century, people got terribly excited about this new kind of flower. The tulip is a remarkably beautiful, particularly in terms of its color. And it became a kind of fad, if you like, widely admired, widely purchased. And so it occurred to people to begin to buy and sell tulip bulbs and to begin to function as though it were money. People shouldn't find this bizarre. In the history of the human race, money has been seashells, and it has been bits of metal like copper and gold and silver and other things. So there's a long history of various kinds of commodities taking on another form, whatever they were before, jewelry or a flower or whatever it was. They then become mediums of exchange. People use them to sell whatever they're selling for that thing, like a tulip bulb, and then turning around and using the tulip bulb to buy other things, or as a store of wealth. In order to hold your wealth in a form that could be easily transformed into something else, you hold gold, or you hold the tulip.
Yeah, and if I could jump in real quick, sure. My recollection is, and I studied this in high school, so that's a long time ago, but my recollection is that the tulip bulbs went from, in terms of today's dollars, from being worth $2 or $3 a bulb to being literally $16,000, $17,000, $18,000 a bulb back in the day, back in the 1700s.
Yeah. Right, because what began to happen is that the interest in using the bulb as a dollar got way out ahead of how many bulbs there actually were. And then the price started to be bid up, and then people came in who didn't care about tulips as flowers and who didn't really care about tulips as money with which to buy and sell things. they wanted in on something that was going up in price really quickly, and they hoped they would be nimble enough to buy it at a price lower, hopefully a lot lower than what they could resell it. And for a while, speculators, if you want to call them that, began to come in. And of course, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If they come in with that intention and they can begin to do it, then others want to do it and they get in on it. And by the way, everything we're talking about has an application to Bitcoin and to the many, many other cryptocurrencies that have followed in Bitcoin. Let me say a couple things, though, about it that also come from the tulip mania. At a certain point, it didn't go very well. The price stopped going up, and an enormous number of people who had bought them, the tulip bulbs, in hopes they would go up, now seeing them go down, dumped their bulbs to get out before it went further down. And of course, that too is a self-fulfilling action, because when you dump so it doesn't go down, it goes down even faster, bringing more dumpers in, and the happy ride up is followed by the disastrous ride down. Look, Bitcoin, just to take the last year, begins a year ago, roughly $60,000 per Bitcoin. By a few months later, it's down to 30,000. That is, it dropped by half. Then again, it went up to 70,000, and today, and then it dropped to 35,000, and today it's around 39,000. This is a wildly insecure way of investing or of holding your wealth. I mean, the dream is to get in on the low point and ride it up. But you never know when the up is over until it turns into a down. And if you're not paying attention literally every hour, the thing can disappear on you very, very fast. This is an up and down instability that no major currency, such as the dollar or the euro or the Japanese yen or the Chinese yuan, they don't move anything like that. So you may not get the big up, but you're certainly not going to get the big down. And therefore, people who are attracted by the wild numbers should be very, very careful. Having said that, there is an element here that is even more important in the long run. The United States dollar has been the world currency ever since the British pound stopped being that because of the collapse of the British Empire, and so the pound no longer could or did play that role. The American empire, and I know this is hard for people to get their heads around, the American empire is in growing difficulty, and the questions and the challenges to the US dollar are mounting, and people around the world are noticing all of that. Not so much here in the United States, because it's hard for us to face it. It was hard in England and Britain for them to face it as they went down over the last century. But the reality is central bankers, wealthy corporations, rich people around the world wondering how to hold their wealth are more and more anxious about keeping whatever portion of it they have invested in the US dollar. So they're moving more and more, for example, to the Chinese yuan, because that looks like the up-and-coming empire, or diversifying more into Europe or Japan and so on. And here comes the new option, cryptocurrency. And so there begins to be this official interest in having some kind of relationship to cryptocurrency, not so much because of a belief in it as a desire to spread your risk so that you're not in this period of shifting empire, that you're not caught with all of your eggs in one vulnerable basket. And that's giving a little bit of legs to the Bitcoin and some of the other currencies, and leading some businesses to accept payment, at least to a limited extent. But again, let me warn you, and there the tulip mania is a good example. It is not secure. The notion that using blockchain technology makes sure there will not be chicanery, illegality, manipulation, that is a mistake. We don't even know what kinds of technological breakthroughs are being worked on now by people who see the kind of money they could make with a volatile up and down currency like this in a world that is changing so dramatically as ours is. So I would take caution. If you're going to go in there, be very, very careful. Do not commit anything like a major part of your asset.
Yeah, sounds like wise advice. Professor Richard Wolff, his new book, The Sickness is the System, democracyatwork.info. Professor Wolff, thank you so much for dropping by.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
Always great talking with you. We'll be right back. It's 15 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, the True People's Media. Stick around.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
What are the bombshells from the January 15th committee, 6th committee that are hanging around in plain sight? Let's talk about that right after the break. And welcome back. I cannot read and speak at the same time without mixing them up. That's just what just happened. Anyhow, welcome back. Yes, it was January 6th. I know there wasn't a second one, although, they keep trying to pull it off. Anyhow, Anthony in Detroit. Hey, Anthony, what's on your mind today? Anthony? No, Anthony. Okay, let's try Nanette in Monrovia, California. Hey, Nanette, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom.
Hi.
In reference to your guest earlier talking about unity of a racially diverse democracy.
Yascha Mounk.
And the other day I had a thought about this. What if Americans started identifying as American Italian, American German, American African versus
we once did.
The other way around?
We once did. I mean, in the latter part of the 1800s, in that period from around 1870, when the anti-Chinese laws were passed by Congress, I think that was 1876, right up through the early 20th century, the 19-teens, in fact. Particularly in the East Coast big cities, you had wars going on, riots and open, murderous hostility literally between Italian immigrants and Irish immigrants. So we've been there.
Right. So anyways, I'm saying if we referred to ourselves using our ethnic origins as a modifier, but identifying as American first, it could go a long way to perhaps instilling some unity in this very diverse nation.
Well, that's interesting. So if I started calling myself a Norwegian American, but I'm only, my father was 100% Norwegian, so I'm half Norwegian, but, I'm also British and Welsh from my mother. And so how do you do, I think at the end of the day, Nanette, pretty much all of us are really kind of mongrels. Maybe we should just stop all those any kind of ethnic is not the word, country associations. I don't know. I don't see any easy answers here, Nanette. I think we just need to learn how to live and work together.
If we identify as Americans first, that would go a long way in my thinking.
Yeah.
I had two other quick thoughts.
Okay.
Now that Ketanji Brown Jackson has been confirmed, is there anything that says that Breyer couldn't change his mind and not retire?
No.
That's
well,
one.
It's conceivable, but extremely unlikely. There's no laws, around this. Yeah,
Just
go ahead.
A thought. And my third thought was, after watching Servant of the People on Netflix, it occurred to me that a servant of the people could be for Vladimir Putin what the White House Correspondents' Dinner was to Donald Trump when he was being roasted by Obama.
Now, I have not seen this. This is the movie that made Alexei Navalny famous, right? Or the TV show?
Right. It's a television series about a hapless history professor that gets elected president. And
what did I say?
You know, there are multiple references to Russia and their aggression and blah, blah, blah. And he openly states that Ukraine wants to go a different way than Russia in the program. The character states this. Right. And I just thought, wow, that seems like an apt comparison to me.
Yeah.
So that's all.
That's interesting. I think you may well be right in that. Thank you very much for the call. Certainly, you know, catapulted him into fame and fortune, as the old saying goes. And it's fascinating to see Petro Poroshenko, who is his political rival, kind of the Mitt Romney to his, Hillary Clinton or whatever, really getting on board with one Ukraine. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Welcome back. 20 minutes past the hour. Kyle Cheney wrote a great piece over at Politico.com a day or so ago titled January 6th Committee's Bombshells Hiding in Plain Sight. And I really thought it was worth just, for those of you who have not been carefully following this, this is the stuff that has just been made public that is essentially irrefutable. And, you know, he writes, shoes have been dropping like hail. Yes. Number one, Trump strained federal and state governments to the point of to the breaking point in his attempt to overturn the election, and it almost worked. Cheney doesn't make this point in his article, or at least in these words, but I've seen it made elsewhere, that had only 5 Republicans flipped. Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, the Republican in Michigan, this young white Republican who then lost his job as a result of this, who refused to change the outcome of, I believe it was the Macomb County vote. It was one of the northern, largely white Detroit suburbs. A Republican. He publicly refused to say, oh yeah, there was fraud and therefore we should give the state to Donald Trump. There was a guy in Arizona. There were 2 people in Arizona, same thing. There was somebody in Wisconsin. I mean, you look at these, it was literally 5 or 6 people. And of course, Mike Pence. If any of them had caved to Trump, we would have President Donald Trump right now. And we would no longer be a democracy. And I think most Americans are, frankly, unaware of this. Number 2, when the courts failed him, Trump turned to John Eastman and broke the law. John Eastman had this wackadoodle theory that I predicted in March of 2020. I wrote an op-ed about this that was published over on alternate.org, in which I laid out exactly how the election of 1876 went. And this was the Tilden-Hayes election. And Tilden, the Democrat, won the majority of the electoral votes, and he won the majority of the popular votes. But he did not become president. Instead, Rutherford Hayes, the Republican, became president. And the reason why was because 4 states, Oregon, which was controlled by the Klan at the time, and 3 southern states, and my recollection is it was Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia, but I might be 1 state off on that. 3 southern states who were at that time occupied by northern troops, by American troops, submitted dueling slates of electors. These 4 states submitted one set of electors for Tilden and another set of electors for Hayes. And as a result of that, the election got thrown into the House of Representatives, where they said, we're going to give it to the Republican because the House was controlled by the Republicans. This is what John Eastman thought he could do again. And like I said, I predicted it in March. I hope that I didn't give Eastman the idea. I suppose it's remotely possible. But this, is not the way it's supposed to work, to say the very least. So we got very, very close there. Number 3, Trump sat on his hands amid the worst of the January 6th violence. He literally was watching all his violence on television, rewinding it over and over again to watch the juicy, oh, look at that, a cop getting sprayed in the face. I mean, we don't know the details of what he was rewinding, but there's ample reports that he was completely ignoring everybody saying, call off your dogs, and in fact was encouraging them. And then he tweeted, Mike Pence has let us down, and then began the chants, hang Mike Pence. Trump was directing this. The White House, number 5, number 5, the White House has become a haven for conspiracy theories. This also happened in the White House. I don't think that needs much more explanation, bringing Sidney Powell into the White House, for example. And the rioters themselves, the people who showed up on January 6th to try to murder the vice president and the Speaker of the House and stop the counting of the electoral votes, they themselves, over 100 of them now, in court filings, have claimed that the only reason they did this was because the President of the United States told them to, Donald Trump. This is pretty consequential stuff. This is very consequential stuff. So there's that. The other story I wanted to share with you, and this is, I find absolutely remarkable, is Marjorie Taylor Greene. This is proof, more proof, if you need it, that there is an element within the Republican Party that not only does not want democracy and is just fine with aristocracy or oligarchy, but also is fine with theocracy, with religious figures running the country as long as they run according to these people. Marjorie Taylor Greene was interviewed, did an hour-long interview in her home with this far-right Catholic news organization. It's called Church Militant. They used to call themselves Catholic Church Militant. The church sued them, according to this news report over at Raw Story by Kathleen Joyce, or actually on Salon. The church prevented them from using the word Catholic. But they present themselves as, it was originally founded as Real Catholic TV. Michael Voris was the founder back in 2008. And he has described the church, the Catholic Church, hierarchy as, quote, an international crime syndicate, end quote, run by a gay cabal. And Marjorie Taylor Greene was like, totally with him, basically saying that the Pope is Satan or is controlled by Satan. And, they're calling for the right-wing Catholics to purge the Church of the Pope and take political power. Milo Yiannopoulos is part of this whole thing. He's in tight with these church militant folks. He recently declared, after returning to the Catholic faith, that had helped him become ex-gay. Similar to Voris, the guy who founded this, who also said that he is no longer going to have same-sex relationships and is going to live a chaste life. It strikes me that, and with Marjorie Taylor Greene as well, these two men and Marjorie Taylor Greene, that we're looking at really badly wounded individuals who are grabbing for power however they can get it. And I think this should be a danger point. This should be a warning, particularly for Republicans and Catholics. Look out.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be back with your calls and the news of the day right after this break. Stick around. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Tyranny, From Plato to Trump, Fools, Sycophants, and Citizens by Andrew Fiala. This is from the preface. It starts out with a quote from Mary Wollstonecraft from her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Quote, tyrants would have cause to tremble if reason were to become the rule of duty. We recently witnessed the failure of a would-be tyrant who attempted to subvert the rule of law and overturn the result of a democratic election. The American system was pushed toward a cliff, but constitutional guardrails slowed things down. Conscientious people pumped the brakes, and the system held. This was a lesson of tyranny averted. We should take stock and learn what worked and what needs improvement in our system and in our souls. And while the American crisis of 2020-2021 was frightening, a broader historical perspective helps. The threat of tyranny is common, but the cure is well known. It involves virtuous citizenship and a stable constitution. The tyrant's rise and fall is an old story. Consider, a plague descended on the nation as the tyrant ranted and raved, refusing to admit that he was the cause of the nation's ills. The tyrant lived in a fantasy world of his own creation. He refused to accept what was said by those who spoke truth to power. Instead, he listened only to those who flattered his ego and encouraged him in his delusions. The nation suffered profoundly under the tyrant and his plague. He tried to blame the plague on some other scapegoat. Members of the public were seduced by the tyrant and his sycophants to sacrifice everything on behalf of a lie. Violence erupted. When the awful truth was finally revealed, the chorus reached a tragic conclusion. Our lives were mere shadows, and then there's a block of poetry here. Our lives were mere shadows. Happiness fades away to nothing. The tyrant's fall reminds us that no human creation lasts forever. Plague and trouble make victims of us all. This is from Oedipus, the Tyrant, lines 1190. This is the story of Oedipus. It is also the story of Donald Trump. The players in this tragedy are found throughout history. They are the tyrant, his sycophants, and the moronic masses. The tyrant rages, the sycophants simper, the masses cheer and howl, fight and die. As the plague spreads, good things fall apart and decency suffers. This tragedy brings with it the risk of despair. The good news is that the cure for this disease is well known. It is, as Mary Wollstonecraft suggested, reason. Life in general must be made reasonable. This means we need a reasonable constitution as well as wise and virtuous citizens. Wisdom and virtue work together to prevent tyranny. Plato and Aristotle knew this, as did John Adams. Adams wrote in his diary when he was Vice President of the United States, quote, "Tyranny can scarcely be practiced upon a virtuous and wise people." But wisdom, virtue, and reason are often lacking. Wollstonecraft, I've got my Marys wrong. This is Wollstonecraft, I'm sorry. Wollstonecraft laments the fact that, quote, "tyranny in whatever part of society it rears its brazen front will ever undermine morality." Tyranny is not only a political problem, it is also a moral and spiritual one. It afflicts our souls as well as churches, businesses, and family life. Wollstonecraft's important contribution was to argue that for the liberation of women in an era when women were oppressed by the tyranny of patriarchal families. Wollstonecraft was a contemporary of Thomas Jefferson and other thinkers of the 18th century Enlightenment. Despite their claims to enlightenment, the heroes of this tradition suffered from moral blindness, as we all do. Jefferson's words inspired a revolution against the tyrant King George III. The words inscribed in the Jefferson Memorial state, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." But Jefferson owned slaves, one of the more obvious forms of tyranny in the world. We must all be careful of our blind spots. Reason aims to shed light by holding up a mirror. The remedy for tyranny is philosophical self-examination. This is an ongoing process, not a panacea. Each generation must seek to make progress on their path to enlightenment. The good news is that we have made progress. Women were liberated and slavery was abolished. The idea that wisdom and virtue can cure tyranny predates the Enlightenment by over 2,000 years. It was the solution proposed by the ancient Greeks, who gave us the very language we will employ here. Words such as tyranny, sycophancy, democracy, and political philosophy. The Greeks emphasized the need for virtue among the players in the political drama. Modern thinkers built upon this and emphasized the need for a rational system of government that prevents tyranny. Tragedy is avoided when leaders and citizens are virtuous and when a stable constitutional system guarantees individual rights, divides power, and creates checks and balances. We have known the cure for thousands of years, but the disease is genetic. Every generation or so, the conditions conspire to bring together an ugly cast of characters that includes the tyrant, his sycophants, and the moronic fools who cheer him on. The book, Tyranny from Plato to Trump, by Andrew Fiala. Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. Welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you, picking up your phone calls. Scott in Oakland, California. Hey, Scott, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. So I'm an old school political junkie, you know, going back to all the dirty tricks, you know, everything that was happening under Nixon. So I'm going to use a term here that we need to probably put in front of this McCarthy stuff, especially the phone call with Scalise.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it was a limited hangout by McCarthy.
A limited hangout?
A limited hangout, which was a term that Nixon used to try to get bad news out in front of the press so that they could say when the press broke the news, they could say, oh, that's old news. We already talked about that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It's a term, limited hangout. It's a you know, it's, again, this goes to, you know, intrigue and dirty tricks and okay, so I believe this, and it's you can call it whatever you want, but that's sort of a commonly used phrase for this kind of technique where you try to get bad, you know, this is what public relations people do. They try to soften the blow by getting it out in front of people so that people, you know, oh, that was yesterday's news, and
you want to be the guy who breaks the news. Point made, Scott. So that's what you think. I mean, McCarthy didn't release these tapes. You know, nobody knows where these.
I don't know who. We don't know. But they said it was Cheney, and then they said no, probably wasn't her. And then they said it was Elise Stefanik because she's trying to knock McCarthy off. Point is.
Well, now they're also saying it might be a person on McCarthy's staff because apparently his staffers were on the call.
And that's understandable because the staff, I hear a lot of the Republican staff are really angry about January 6th. The point is, think about who's getting hurt here. This is a fire break. McCarthy, I believe, is trying to dig a fire break between himself and the crazies because he knows how bad it's going to be when this stuff actually starts hitting. Okay. With the hearings. Right. So I believe this is McCarthy. Now, this is just my, scan of it. Mm-hmm. But I believe this is McCarthy trying to dig a fire break between Gates, Taylor Greene, Gosart, Biggs, Brooks, and Perry.
Right.
So the point is, do you remember right before January 6th, I believe it was, there was this story that broke about Giuliani accidentally calling Mike Lee,
right,
and
saying when he was trying to reach Tuberville.
He was trying to reach Tuberville. The point is, this thing is a diseased cancer that goes through the entire party. McCarthy would have gone along with the insurrection. He wasn't against it. He just backed out.
No, I get what you're saying, Scott. Whether it's a fire break or not, I don't know. But what I do know is that after Mike Lee went through one of these things where all this stuff came out about 2 weeks ago about Mike Lee being one of the major people who was pushing for the fake electors to be recognized so that Donald Trump could become president for another 4 years, that he went back to Utah and he got a standing ovation. So it may be that these guys are worried about the fallout. It may be that they're not at all worried about the fallout because they're Republicans. Bill in Eagleville, California. Bill, you wanted to get back to the war in Ukraine. You wanted to discuss that?
Well, yes.
Go for it. You are on the air, Bill. Bill, I think you might have hit the mute button on your phone. I don't know what happened, but I don't hear Bill. Let's try Dr. Bay in Hertford, Connecticut. Hey, Bill, Dr. Bay, what's up?
Well, good afternoon. It's Hertford, North Carolina.
Hertford. Yeah, North Carolina. Okay.
Well,
what's up?
Right, like now. Bear with me for 1 minute.
Okay.
I happen to be a holistic doctor. That means that I just don't use drugs, and I look at the whole person. So we use herbs, we look at the whole person. The first thing a person does when they come to, not even come to see me, but they usually speak to me on the phone, or they'll speak to me through the internet, they say, this is my problem. Doc, what have you got for it? They don't want to hear about how long it's going to take to fix. They don't want to hear about how long it took them to get to this point, and it's usually 20 to 30 years. They want a relief and I can give them some relief, but I can't help them get better in a matter of days or weeks.
Sure, and I'm guessing that this is an analogy to something political?
Exactly. But the first thing I have to get them to admit is that they did do it.
You've been eating too much sugar for too many years, and surprise, surprise, you know, your teeth are falling out, or whatever it may be. I absolutely get it. So are you speaking of, you know, some specific? Monk. Okay, Yascha Monk. So you're talking about racism.
Right, not just racism, but everything that we're doing.
Right.
But specifically, we can spread out from the racism to talk about other things. When he says Dr. DeAngelis is saying that all white people are racist, as in a bad thing, because it's not just so-called white people. They're Europeans. This system, and you fell into that trap by saying it's not law that's making people separate now. Yes, it is. It is law. They have been raised on a particular law. Again, like 30 years of sugar, 30 years of bad diet, and now you have problems. So we have been raised on this from day one in this country. I speak to people, and many of them, all of my clients, have seen me in person. When they hear me speak, they don't realize that I have color. I've had people hang up on me because I'm a woman. I have a sister that's a surgeon, and she comes in, and she happens to be short, and she's a woman. I want to see the doctor, not the nurse.
Yeah.
It's still going forward, but I'm saying my point is that you must admit what you have done incorrectly, and then you have to take steps to correct it. And just because you've written a law in 1960, 1965, or even 1975, you are not going to correct it, and you are going to backslide, and that's what's happening now. And until we can face up to that, and yes, there have been ancient civilizations that did have multi-ethnic people. There are over 3,000 different ethnic groups in Africa. One of the major problems now, because you made false borders, and now they're crushed together, and they can't find ways to deal with each other.
Right, the legacy of
Egypt was made of thousands of groups. But we must admit what we have done incorrectly, and then slowly but surely take the steps to fix it, do things to fix it, and then we can get out of this mess.
This is where it gets difficult or complicated. I mean, you know, we tried busing back in the 70s. We've tried all kinds of things. I mean, what are the steps that you take to create a genuinely multiracial, pluralistic society?
But busing was another quick fix.
I totally get it. So I'm saying, you know, that didn't work. So what are you suggesting? What Professor Mounk was suggesting basically was, you know, we all need to learn how to live together. You know, we need to stop identifying people by racial groups or what. Name one country where this has ever worked. It's not working. It's not working in Israel. It's not working in South Africa. It's not working here. Or maybe it is working.
They didn't plan on it to work in any of those places to start with. Again, if you make things just fair, and you work on being fair. I come from a big family, and I can tell you, and the people may be upset with this, but I'm going to say it flat out. So my mother was never fair.
Right. So what you're saying is that we need to put into stronger laws against discrimination. Essentially, is that your argument? Because I don't disagree with that.
Not just discrimination, but it has to be fairly placed.
Yeah.
So that if someone puts a gun to the back of someone's head and pulls the trigger, there has to be some way to say, you have to answer for that.
Right, like the cop in Grand Rapids.
Individually.
Yeah.
It's not him individually, because we keep saying, the bad apple. It's not the bad apple, it's the system.
Yeah, no, I get it, Dr. B. I totally get it, and your point is very well made. Thank you very much. Anthony in Detroit. Hey, Anthony, you wanted to get back to Bitcoin?
Yeah. Hey, Tom, I don't think it's, well, I've heard it compared to the tulip thing, but you know, I don't think it's like that because the tulip thing lasted for, as far as I know, like 4 years. Or
I think it was 2 years, maybe 3. Yeah.
And I think this is since 2009, so it's still going. At least Bitcoin, and I wanted to make the distinction in Bitcoin.
Yeah, but all Bitcoin is basically is electricity that's been processed by a computer, and you know, at a certain point, the price of electricity starts dropping, and this is happening, you know, all over the world as people are moving to solar and wind. As the price of electricity drops, the price of creating Bitcoin drops, and now you've got a gold rush going on. I mean, gold, when the gold rush in California happened, gold could actually be converted into currency. With the tulips, you could grow, it was basically, input, water and dirt, output tulips, right? Tulip bulbs. But this, and now you got, input electricity, output Bitcoin. But that's, to the best of my knowledge, that's not how currencies are supposed to work. Currencies are established typically by governments so that there is some oversight, some structure to it.
Well, the Central African Republic just adopted Bitcoin as legal tender today, joining El Salvador as the second country. So
yeah, we've got two countries doing it. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think it's an extraordinary experiment, and I'm fascinated by it. And I'm not a partisan in these Bitcoin wars. I'm not saying, we should trash it or it's crazy, and I'm not saying it should become the world currency. I'm kind of waiting to see how this all shakes out. But I do think it's fascinating. But I also think that the amount of electricity that's being consumed to make this stuff is quickly becoming an issue around the world. Anthony, thanks for the call. It's 45 minutes past the hour. We'll continue our conversations on all these various topics in just a moment. So much on the table, so much going on in the world right now. It's just an amazing time to be alive. We'll be right back. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archive.
Defending America from the weapons of mass deception. I'll be right back with you. And welcome back. Corky in Rochester, New York. Hey, Corky, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind today?
Well, I want to talk about racism and time. I think I figured out what Dr. King was talking about when he said, I've been to the mountain. I won't get there with you, but we'll get there. And I think it's time, because with the interracial marriages taking place, producing offspring, and there are some races that mix that produce really gorgeous women and handsome men,
Yeah, be careful here, Corky, where you're going with this, because our understanding of what is gorgeous or handsome is, being run through a cultural filter, and that then I remember Dick Gregory when he used to be on the board of this organization that I ran up in New Hampshire, and we traveled around the world together. And I remember one time him talking about Aunt Jemima, and he said, I never ever wanted to hop into bed with Aunt Jemima, but all those white ladies on TV that they were pushing at me all the time. Now, keep in mind this conversation, he and I had back in the 1970s. But he said, all those white ladies on TV that they're pushing at me all the time, they look good, or words to that effect. I mean, and he was telling it as a joke, essentially. But our standards of beauty are cultural there is this one notion out of science that the more symmetrical a person's face is, the more beautiful they are universally acknowledged to be, regardless of their race. So there's that. But then everything else is a function of culture. So be careful, Corky. I get it that you think that, everybody marrying everybody is going to solve the problem. I don't think that's going to solve the problem. I think it's a step. But anyhow, Earl in Hyde Park, Illinois. Hey, Earl, what's on your mind?
Hey, we came in your visit today, Tom.
So what?
I wanted to go back to Tucker Carlson. And McCarthy. Now, many years ago, when we were doing the Mueller investigation, there was a judge on right-wing media, Judge Napolitano, and he was the guru of all things, legal and legislative. And so I remember one day he was on Fox and Friends, and early in the morning, and so he came out with this pronouncement that if Mueller's allegations have been proven true, then Trump is guilty.
Right.
You could have dropped a pin in that studio audience. I mean, nobody on that curvy couch smiled. They didn't know how to react and or anything else. So what I'm saying is that when you go against the, whatever the public policy is, you are not going to be around long. That's why McCarthy.
You're talking about specifically on Fox News, or in Republican land in general, or in media in general? What's the context here?
I'm saying in Fox News, the talking spear of Trump world,
Yeah.
Because Judge has never appeared in any of the other programs, either on other channels, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah.
So, when you go against the king, you better make sure you kill him, or else you're going to get killed. So that was the point I was trying to make.
And obviously, we're not talking about killing people here. We're talking about an ancient metaphor that goes back, 500 years.
Sorry,
Earl, no, I got it. I totally got it. Thanks a lot for the call. We'll be right back. Hey, I've got a new book out. It's called The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, How the Death of Privacy and the Rise of Surveillance Threaten Us and Our Democracy. Available wherever you find fine books. So how do you know which party has the most crooks in it? The Republicans are always saying, oh, those Democrats are soft on crime and, a lot of murders in Democrat-run cities. Well, for the record, first off, red states and red counties have a higher per capita murder rates than do blue states and blue counties. It's just a fact. But secondly, let's look at some of the administrations. I mean, the Obama administration had no criminal indictments. The Jimmy Carter administration had 1. The Bill Clinton administration had 2. But what about the Republican administrations? It was 16 for George W. Bush. It was 26 criminal indictments for Ronald Reagan. Richard Nixon's administration had 76 criminal indictments. And, of course, the full-time professional rapist and grifter, Donald Trump, he had 215 criminal indictments. So who's really soft on crime? We got a video about it over at ThomHartmann.com. You can check it out. And welcome back, picking up your phone calls. Jim in Columbus, Ohio. Hey, Jim, what's on your mind today?
It's actually Tim, as in Timothy.
Oh, Tim, I'm sorry. I'll fix that. So
no
what's up, Tim?
Yeah. Hey, listen, if I had a friend or an accomplice and drove to a bank or to a store and to commit a crime, and my accomplice went inside and robbed, injured, or killed somebody on the inside, I'd be charged with that felony.
You're right.
If I was as a driver.
As an accessory, yeah.
As an accessory, right. Why hasn't Trump, and I haven't heard anybody from the media say that Trump is actually an accessory to a person that got killed inside of the Capitol? And this isn't including the other officers that died the days after.
So Ashley Babbitt's death is on his hands, or on his head. I think it's a good point, Tim. I'm guessing that this is the kind of stuff that they're going to be shoveling to the Department of Justice eventually. It's the kind of stuff that you would think the DOJ would be all over right now, although, who knows?
And I remember the right-wing media or whatever, that they made that woman that broke through was one
Ashley
of the first
Babbitt,
people to actually go into the window and got shot and killed. They made her a martyr.
Yep.
But then I've noticed they really quieted that down, too. They don't mention that anymore. At least I haven't heard it lately.
Yeah, no, they wanted to get the message out that a white woman was killed by a black cop, and that that is now permanently and firmly implanted in the brains of MAGA followers all across the country. They don't need to repeat it anymore because they all know it, and it was just another way of spreading their racist poison. Tim, your points are well taken. We'll have to see how this shakes out with the January 6th committee. Richard in Chicago. Hey, Richard, thanks for listening to WCPT. What's up?
It's maybe not a big point, but so many people that support Bitcoin. I always think about the people who want to go back to the gold standard, right, and are mad at the Fed for creating money, and yet I wonder how many of them are just enamored with
this counter to government, I guess, is sort of the way I think they look at Bitcoin. The savior of the free market or something. But anyway, it's kind of a wild point, maybe. But
if somebody could mine dollars, using computers, you would. I would be very concerned about the faith and confidence of the dollar. I mean, I would think that would undermine the integrity of the dollar.
Doesn't it actually do that, though? I mean, after all, everything, even a gold standard, at one point is transferred into dollars, but they somehow don't like the Federal Reserve doing it. They want to go back to the ancient.
It is.
None of it makes sense to me.
Yeah, it is a weird kind of a weird juxtaposition. Richard, thank you. That was an excellent point. Alejandro in Miami. Hey, Alejandro, what's on your mind today?
What's on my mind is that I think finally Marjorie Taylor Greene is the chickens are coming home to roost with her with the whole trial that she's been forced to participate in, and I love it because what I like as an attorney, what I love about court is that you can only BS so much, and in court because you have to say the truth or else you commit perjury, right? And so I feel like finally she's getting some accountability for her statements that she can't run away from.
But she's fundraising on this, Alejandro, and she's raising money hand over fist. She's got literally millions of dollars.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, there's a lot of stupid people who support her nonsense, but
that's my point. I'm not sure there's any chickens coming home to roost here. It looks to me like the money's coming home to roost.
Well, what I'm getting at is obviously this is a novel, legal case, right? I don't think there's ever been a 14th Amendment lawsuit. I never think there's ever been a lawsuit based on the 14th Amendment to disqualify someone for running for Congress. So I think it's a novel case, and I'm very excited that somebody finally filed because I think that it will show us whether the 14th Amendment has teeth to prevent insurrectionists from ever getting office. And I think she's disqualified to run for office because she's a moron of all proportions, for many reasons. But I definitely think this should definitely disqualify her because I definitely think the evidence that's presented in trial shows that she was involved in an insurrection. She incited it, she encouraged it, and that violates the 14th Amendment, Section 3, that states that anyone engaged in the insurrection or rebellion against the same or gave aid and comfort to the enemies, has to be barred from office. So, like the whole point is, I was chomping at the bits, and I would watching her cross-examination of the attorney, excoriating her, what we call impeaching the witness, making her look so stupid. But every time she said, "I don't recall," it just gives the opportunity for the attorney to present evidence that contradicts what she says. And I think that definitely shows that she's committing perjury because there's no way she doesn't recall a lot of those things.
Do you think she'll ever be charged with perjury, Alejandro?
I think there's evidence to show that because all the evidence on Facebook.
No, I got that. I think it's right there on its face. I'm skeptical that she'll be charged, and I'm skeptical that this thing is going to go through. But I agree with you. It's absolutely fascinating to watch, and it is unprecedented. Alejandro, always great to hear from you. Thank you very much for the call. It is, we're hitting the top of the hour here. On the other side of the hour, I want to get into this whole pandemic thing. What's going on with this?
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, how the death of privacy and the rise of surveillance threaten us and our democracy by Thom Hartmann. More information at all book outlets. Wild Alaskan Company, 100% sustainable wild-caught seafood delivered right to your door. More info at wildalaskancompany.com/Tom. Cozy Earth, better sleep, better you. More info at cozyearth.com, promo code TOM. The latest views and opinions from U.S. politics and other fascinating subjects too, including cutting-edge science reports at hartmanreport.com. And Dinovite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at dinovite.com.
We say fight back!
the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Tyranny, From Plato to Trump, Fools, Sycophants, and Citizens by Andrew Fiala. This is from the preface. It starts out with a quote from Mary Wollstonecraft from her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Quote, tyrants would have cause to tremble if reason were to become the rule of duty. We recently witnessed the failure of a would-be tyrant who attempted to subvert the rule of law and overturn the result of a democratic election. The American system was pushed toward a cliff, but constitutional guardrails slowed things down. Conscientious people pumped the brakes, and the system held. This was a lesson of tyranny averted. We should take stock and learn what worked and what needs improvement in our system and in our souls. And while the American crisis of 2020-2021 was frightening, a broader historical perspective helps. The threat of tyranny is common, but the cure is well known. It involves virtuous citizenship and a stable constitution. The tyrant's rise and fall is an old story. Consider, a plague descended on the nation as the tyrant ranted and raved, refusing to admit that he was the cause of the nation's ills. The tyrant lived in a fantasy world of his own creation. He refused to accept what was said by those who spoke truth to power. Instead, he listened only to those who flattered his ego and encouraged him in his delusions. The nation suffered profoundly under the tyrant and his plague. He tried to blame the plague on some other scapegoat. Members of the public were seduced by the tyrant and his sycophants to sacrifice everything on behalf of a lie. Violence erupted. When the awful truth was finally revealed, the chorus reached a tragic conclusion. Our lives were mere shadows, and then there's a block of poetry here. Our lives were mere shadows, happiness fades away to nothing. The tyrant's fall reminds us that no human creation lasts forever. Plague and trouble make victims of us all. This is from Oedipus, the Tyrant, lines 1190. This is the story of Oedipus. It is also the story of Donald Trump. The players in this tragedy are found throughout history. They are the tyrant, his sycophants, and the moronic masses. The tyrant rages, the sycophants simper, the masses cheer and howl, fight and die. As the plague spreads, good things fall apart and decency suffers. This tragedy brings with it the risk of despair. The good news is that the cure for this disease is well known. It is, as Mary Wollstonecraft suggested, reason. Life in general must be made reasonable. This means we need a reasonable constitution as well as wise and virtuous citizens. Wisdom and virtue work together to prevent tyranny. Plato and Aristotle knew this, as did John Adams. Adams wrote in his diary when he was Vice President of the United States, quote, tyranny can scarcely be practiced upon a virtuous and wise people. But wisdom, virtue, and reason are often lacking. Wollstonecraft, I've got my Marys wrong. This is Wollstonecraft, I'm sorry. Wollstonecraft laments the fact that, quote, tyranny in whatever part of society it rears its brazen front will ever undermine morality. Tyranny is not only a political problem, it is also a moral and spiritual one. It afflicts our souls as well as churches, businesses, and family life. Wollstonecraft's important contribution was to argue that for the liberation of women in an era when women were oppressed by the tyranny of patriarchal families. Wollstonecraft was a contemporary of Thomas Jefferson and other thinkers of the 18th century Enlightenment. Despite their claims to enlightenment, the heroes of this tradition suffered from moral blindness, as we all do. Jefferson's words inspired a revolution against the tyrant King George III. The words inscribed in the Jefferson Memorial state, I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. But Jefferson owned slaves, one of the more obvious forms of tyranny in the world. We must all be careful of our blind spots. Reason aims to shed light by holding up a mirror. The remedy for tyranny is philosophical self-examination. This is an ongoing process, not a panacea. Each generation must seek to make progress on their path to enlightenment. The good news is that we have made progress. Women were liberated and slavery was abolished. The idea that wisdom and virtue can cure tyranny predates the Enlightenment by over 2,000 years. It was the solution proposed by the ancient Greeks, who gave us the very language we will employ here. Words such as tyranny, sycophancy, democracy, and political philosophy. The Greeks emphasized the need for virtue among the players in the political drama. Modern thinkers built upon this and emphasized the need for a rational system of government that prevents tyranny. Tragedy is avoided when leaders and citizens are virtuous and when a stable constitutional system guarantees individual rights, divides power, and creates checks and balances. We have known the cure for thousands of years, but the disease is genetic. Every generation or so, the conditions conspire to bring together an ugly cast of characters that includes the tyrant, his sycophants, and the moronic fools who cheer him on. The book, Tyranny from Plato to Trump, by Andrew Fiala.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to Hour 3 of our program. Dr. Anthony Fauci has just basically said, the sky is blue, but maybe it's green. Or something like that. That's probably not the best metaphor or analogy or whatever example. But, you know, he came out, this was in an interview with Judy Woodruff on PBS NewsHour night before last night, I guess it was. And he said, here we are, the end of April. Excuse me, this is Judy Woodruff. She said, here we are, the end of April, the spring of 2022. How close are we to the end of this pandemic? And Fauci said, we are certainly right now in this country out of the pandemic phase. He said, namely, we don't have 900,000 new infections a day and tens and tens and tens of thousands of hospitalizations and thousands of deaths. We're at a very low level right now. And he went on to say that we need to keep that level very low and keep people vaccinated, that there's, I mean, basically he's saying we've got high levels of what you might call herd immunity, and we've got, you know, vaccination helping people out. And so, yeah, maybe it's not such a big deal anymore because so many people have immunity. At the same time, I personally, just speaking for myself, I am haunted by the author that we had on this program, maybe 2 months ago or so, who wrote the book about the flu pandemic that everybody says was the flu pandemic of 1918, 1919. Well, it turns out the flu pandemic lasted for 3 years. There was a fourth wave that happened in 1920, and more people died from that than died from the two previous ones. Well, that doesn't appear to be happening what's happening right now. People don't seem to be dying, although literally this morning on CNN they had a medical authority on, and he was saying, you know, we're at tens of thousands of new infections every day. And we are seeing in fact, there's been a 60% increase in new infections. And this is the infections that we know of because somebody got the PCR test, you know, got a swab shoved up to their brain. This does not count the fact that President Biden has sent free millions of home test kits to people. And so you've got millions and millions of people who are getting a sore throat or they're coughing or they're feeling like crap and they're doing their own test, and they're not calling up the public health department and saying, hey, I'm positive, I thought you'd want to know. Not happening. So, you know, the 60,000 new infections a day that we're looking at are just the official numbers. It appears to me that we are in a wave right now. If the official numbers are up 60% over the past 2 weeks, we saw the headline in the Oregonian yesterday was that here in Oregon, we're up 50% over the previous 2 weeks. That's substantial. And what the guy on CNN this morning pointed out is that we are now starting to see a rise in hospitalizations. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is, I suppose, that the rise in hospitalizations is almost exclusively occurring among people who are unvaccinated or who were in such bad shape that the vaccine really didn't help them. It couldn't take effect. They were on immunosuppressive drugs, or they are battling cancer, or they're taking steroids. One of these conditions that basically causes vaccines not to work the way that they're supposed to. So on the one hand, you've got Dr. Fauci saying, yeah, everything's good, which it has become kind of the official mantra of the administration now, and has been, of course, the official mantra of the Republican Party for 2 years. And on the other hand, Dr. Fauci was invited by ABC News to come to the White House Correspondents' Dinner. When Louise and I lived in Washington, D.C., we were the guests of Ellen Ratner and Talk Radio News either 2 or 3 times to these dinners, to the White House Correspondents' Dinners. They are a hoot. And in fact, we were in the room the night that Donald Trump and that President Obama just, ridiculed Donald Trump. We were just, probably 50 feet away from Donald Trump and from Barack Obama, for that matter, as that was happening. And then, of course, later, just hours after that, Barack Obama went back to the White House Situation Room and oversaw the assassination of Osama bin Laden. I mean, it was a pretty big deal, which humiliated Donald Trump, and I think propelled him in part to challenge Hillary Clinton for the White House. But in any case, Anthony Fauci has these White House Correspondents' Dinners, when they happen, and we haven't had one for 2 years because of coronavirus. When they happen, they're a big deal. And being invited by a major news organization like ABC to sit at their table, I mean, this is big deal stuff. And Fauci, who had just said the pandemic is over, said, I'm not going to the Correspondents' Dinner. He said, I did an individual assessment of my own personal risk, and I don't think it's a good idea to go. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but the individual assessment of personal risk that's his language. In other words, he thinks he might get coronavirus. He might get COVID if he shows up at the Correspondents' Dinner. He thinks that it might be a super spreader event. Well, if you're concerned that, like the Gridiron Dinner was a couple of weeks ago, we've got all these, Nancy Pelosi, and now you've got the vice president has COVID. Again, that's the bad news. We're in this 4th wave. The good news is none of these people, seem to have gotten really seriously sick, other than just, having to quarantine for a couple of weeks. So how is the pandemic going where you live? I can tell you here in Portland, increasingly, and I'm seeing this with friends, I'm seeing this with neighbors, people are getting very laissez-faire about it, very laid back about it, and oh yeah, okay, so I'll get sick, and I'll be, people are thinking of coronavirus, at least people who are double vaccinated and boosted are thinking of coronavirus like it's going to be like the bad flu, which may well be the case. But if it is the case, why is Anthony Fauci not saying, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll go to the Correspondents' Dinner and I'll probably get COVID and it won't be a big deal"? Is it because he's in his 70s? Well, does that mean that all of us in our 70s or anybody who is over 65 should have a whole different set of standards? So, anyway, I just wanted to share that with you and put it on the table as a point for conversation. I'll tell you how I feel about this. My own personal take on this is that I would prefer not to get COVID. I think that if I do get it, it's not going to be a big deal. I've gotten both boosters because I'm over 65, and I got both of the original shots. But I've known of people who got really, really sick from it, even though they were vaxxed and boosted. But I doubt it's going to kill me or disable me or cripple me. But I'd rather not get it. And so for the moment, I'm not going out because I see this wave happening. Louise and I went to a restaurant a couple days ago that was entirely outdoors. We were able to sit outside. We were able to sit, away from people. The servers wore masks. It was very respectful. And there's a number of restaurants here in Portland that are doing that, and that's comfortable for me. But eventually the time is going to come when we're going to have to creep out into the world, and probably this summer. And we'll see how it shakes out. My brother, who died a month or so ago, there's a service for him in August, and we're thinking, okay, are we going to go to Michigan for this? I mean, these are the reality kind of intervenes. So we'll pick up your calls on that. Also, this Morning Consult Politico poll, if a candidate is accused of racism, 80% of Democrats say that person should be disqualified, or would disqualify them for me. Only 38% of Republicans say that would disqualify them for me. What does this mean? Yascha Mounk was kind of minimizing it because he said, oh, it's just the accusations. I think it's more consequential. What say you?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with your calls on the other side of this break. Stick around. It's 15 minutes past the hour here on the True People's Media, the Thom Hartmann Program. And welcome back, Richard in Los Angeles. Hey, Richard, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching Free Speech.
Thank you for taking my call. I had a question. Adam Schiff the other day mentioned on one of the talk shows that he felt that it would be wrong to go after the Republicans because it would blow up Congress, go after them with subpoenas and indictments.
I know. I think it's a mistake.
I think that would be, if Congress does get blown up and Republicans get removed, one thing, it would strengthen our advantage. And two, wouldn't that be a deterrent for someone not to do that next time?
That's the theory, Richard, and I completely agree with you. Once again, we're seeing, we're seeing Democrats basically wimping out. I mean, just flip the frame, right? If Republicans controlled Congress and they thought that a high-profile Democrat had committed a crime, what would they do? Well, the answer is really easy. What did they do with Hillary Clinton? I mean, Kevin McCarthy came out and famously said to the world, we've had these hearings on Hillary Clinton and it's knocked her down 5 or 10 points in the polls, and that's a good thing. It's going to help us beat her in 2020 in the election. And by the way, he was right. So why are Democrats going, oh, well, we don't want to piss off the Republicans because they'll kick us upside the head. They're going to kick you upside the head anyway.
That's right. That's right. And I got your bumper sticker. Make democracy great again.
Make democracy great again. That's a good one.
I said, use the same font and with a blue background so it looks just like their bumper sticker. Make democracy great again.
Yeah.
And one thing, there's this guy out here where I live. He's going into these businesses and he's writing on the toilet seat dispensers Donald Trump campaign hats.
That's from where the toilet paper is?
Yeah.
I don't know if I still have it here. We've got a roll of Donald Trump toilet paper around here someplace. I took it off the set because, it is behind me? Aha, there we go. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can see that, Richard. If you're watching Free Speech TV, there's just a slight delay, but there we go.
I'll see you. Thank you, sir. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Great to hear from you. I appreciate the call. We'll be, we still have a minute here. I thought we were at the end. By the way, I mentioned that this survey, this Morning Consult Politico poll, they asked if a candidate is accused of fill in the blank, is that a major problem? And I mentioned racist remarks. 80% of Democrats say, yes, that's a major problem. Only 38% of Republicans say, yes, that's a major problem. It's even worse when it comes to homophobia. Only 71% of Democrats say homophobic remarks are a major problem, which argues that homophobia is a bigger problem in America than racism, frankly. And only 25% of Republicans said if somebody is accused of making homophobic remarks, that would be a problem for them. And then when you get to anti-Semitism, and here the numbers are a little different on the Republican side, and I think that this is largely the hangover from the Holocaust. Even Republicans realize how bad anti-Semitism can get. 71% of Democrats say if somebody made anti-Semitic remarks or was accused of it, that would be a problem. Only 47%. All three of these are below 50%. Fewer than half of Republicans have a problem with people being accused of making racist, homophobic, or anti-Semitic remarks. That seems to me like a problem in our society. What say you? We'll be right back with your calls. It's 19 minutes past the hour. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. We have not in the United States historically protected people's feelings by law. We protect, people from being victims of actions. You can't be discriminated against in a store or a restaurant or a mortgage or anything else based on your race or your gender or your ethnicity or in many cases your sexual identity or gender identity. But it is not typically, typically we don't put into law, you may not hurt somebody's feelings. But that's exactly what Florida is doing with their so-called woke act, the Stop the Wrongs to Our Kids and Employees Act, which basically threatens teachers if they cause their white children or any children to, quote, feel discomfort, guilt, or anguish as a result of what's being taught. This is a dangerous precedent. There's a whole video about it over at thomhartmann.com. You can check it out. Okay, 21 minutes past the hour, picking up your calls. Miguel in Frederick, Maryland. Hey, Miguel, thanks for listening to Sirius XM. What's on your mind today?
Tom, as always, I love your show.
Thank you.
So I'm calling in regards to the person that was talking about racism and making people feel bad. I'm so tired of this discussion. I'm 53 years old. I've lived in integrated communities that were just barely integrated. And repeatedly as a child, I was always walking down the street, someone throws a rock at me, misses me. I throw a rock back, hits them. I'm the trouble. I'm causing trouble. So I'm supposed to go through life abused. It's akin to the Goldilocks story where you see the bears on the ground with guns to their head and the police taking the report from Goldilocks. Right. I'm so tired of the whole idea of the calling out the racism and bigotry and the structural impediments to achieve the American dream in the United States being seen as the new racism. It's white fragility, and that leads to Ron DeSantis. This whole idea that every child that is non-white has to cater to the white child's feelings goes directly to what I came to. And so I'm just so, and this is why I'm independent now, because it's simple. I have no concern losing. I want to lose fighting. This is what I learned in the United States. I learned that even if you're losing, it's not over until it's over. This whole idea of trying to bring people along with that. I had a friend that I cut off when we got into arguing. He's like, I feel like you don't trust me with your kids. And you know what I said? I don't. Because you need to understand that if I leave my child with you, you don't let someone snatch them up because they're a black child. You need to pay attention to what's going on. When I watch your child, I make sure that I take all of that into account. Racism is a deal killer. And if racism is not a deal killer for you, other people can be subject. But after 53 years, I'm like, racism is not something I cotton to. Because I listened to I listened to Niemöller. First they came for the labor unionists, and then, blah, blah, blah. And there's no one left. And that is exactly what's going on. Yeah. Thank you for listening to me.
I totally get it, Miguel. And I'm, racism is a deal breaker for me, too. I'm wondering what the solution is. Is it just that, as Yascha Mounk is implying, or maybe saying, that at some point society reaches a threshold where we pass over, or we get past this, and we just collectively say, okay, this isn't how we're going to run our lives anymore, or our society. We're just not going to accept racism any longer. Or is there?
I think the society. Let me tell you, we've already reached that point. You know, we reached that point when Martin Luther King was shot.
But if we had reached that point, Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump never would have gotten elected.
Yeah, but you see, the problem is that the majority of the black population in the United States in the South. If there wasn't racial gerrymandering and all this other stuff going on there, the Congress would be different. So we're allowing them to pick congressmen that don't represent their own population.
That's true.
And continuing this kind of oligarchic control. So the point is like, how do we bring them along? We bring them along by having our values and standing by it. And if nothing gets done in Congress, if a defense reappropriation bill is not done, they're willing to shut down the government just so that they can have control of some other woman's ovaries.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But we're unwilling to shut down the government to make sure there's a democracy. My point is, if you let the South alone, if you leave those guys alone, don't send them our tax dollars, right? Then they have to deal with the issues. What we do is we allow them, like Joe Manchin, to get everything, and we get nothing. And a democracy only works is when you vote your values. And if we're electing people that don't fight for the values that we have out of patronage. There's a time to be pragmatic, but we're so past that now.
Yeah. So your solution is to get politically active.
I am totally. Every election, don't attach a board of ed. And my point is, and don't bend. It's like if we cannot compromise, what we're doing now is that we're not compromising. We're saying, oh, we'll do what you do. That is domestic violence. Always making an excuse for someone that's abusing you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I totally get it. Yeah. Thank you, Miguel. Well said. Bill in Eagleville, California. Hey, Bill, you got a quick one here?
Hey, hello, Tom. I'm the conscientious objector that you spoke with last Friday.
Uh-huh.
And when I heard you a day or so ago say that you had a revelation that possibly war could be...
That we're being prepared for war.
We're being prepared for war. You're right. But, I stubbed my toe and was a little shocked to find that there is no conflict within me to being a conscientious objector and choosing to go to war this time.
That's what happened in World War II, too. Yeah.
Well, this is World War III. This is democracy. This is freedom versus slavery, really.
I think you're right.
And if we all joined in equally with the Ukrainians to our fullest extent.
Yeah. No, it's going to be a tough one, Bill. But I agree with you. Thank you so much. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
So what say you? We'll pick up your calls on the other side of this break. It's 27 minutes past the hour, helping you win the water cooler wars right here. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is We Will Shoot Back, Armed Resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement by Akinyele Omowale Umoja. This is from the introduction. My father was born in 1915 to a sharecropping family in the Bolivar County village of Alligator in the Mississippi Delta. Dad told me stories about Mississippi when I was growing up in Compton, California. These stories were full of examples of white terrorism and intimidation. One story I heard invoked mixed feelings of fear and pride. My father remembered seeing a black man hanging from a Delta water tower, apparently after being lynched by white supremacists. Angered by this visible assault on black humanity, my grandfather grabbed a rifle and intended to shoot the first white man he saw. My father, his siblings, and my stepfather tackled my grandfather and disarmed him. After hearing this story, I was proud that my grandfather wanted to fight back against the terrorist who lynched one of our people. On the other hand, I understood the fear in the hearts and minds of my father, uncles, and grandmother as they visualized the retaliation that would have been inflicted on my family if my grandfather had carried out his plans. Fear and intimidation were essential elements of the system of subordination of black people and the maintenance of white power in Mississippi and the South during the times of racial slavery and segregation. White supremacist violence was the primary cause of fear and intimidation. The primary social function of this violence was to maintain white political and economic power and the color line during segregation. My grandfather would have most likely been a lone warrior on the day he was disarmed by his loved ones. His anger overcame his fear and motivated him to fight back to confront the perpetrators of that lynching. This book is about black people in Mississippi who picked up guns or other weapons and decided to use force to fight back against those who would deny their human rights and dignity. Ultimately, the black freedom struggle in Mississippi and the South was a fight to overcome fear. Blacks overcame fear and asserted their humanity through a variety of tactics. This story documents the role that armed resistance played in overcoming fear and intimidation and engendering black political, economic, and social liberation. The central argument in We Will Shoot Back, Armed Resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Struggle, is that armed resistance was critical to the efficacy of the Southern freedom struggle and the dismantling of and black disenfranchisement. Intimidation by white supremacists was intended to bring fear to the black population and its allies and sympathizers in the white community. To overcome the legal system of apartheid, black people had to overcome fear to present a significant challenge to white domination. Armed self-defense had been a major tool of survival in allowing some black Southern communities to maintain their integrity and existence in the face of white supremacist terror. By 1965, armed resistance, particularly self-defense, was a significant factor in the effort made by the sons and daughters of enslaved Africans to overturn fear and intimidation and develop different political and social relationships between black and white Mississippians. We Will Shoot Back argues that without armed resistance, primarily organized by local people, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, activists would not have been able to organize in Mississippi. After organizing by SNCC and CORE, armed resistance served as a complement to self-proclaimed nonviolent organizers and organizations from 1961 through 1964. By 1965, armed self-defense and militant rhetoric was chosen by a growing number of Mississippi human rights activists as the alternative to the nonviolent tactics and posture of the early 1960s. This study argues that a tradition of armed resistance existed in the culture of Southern blacks that produced a variety of organizational forms to respond to the necessity of protecting black communities, their leaders, allies, and institutions. The way armed resistance was organized varied in different stages of the freedom struggle in Mississippi. Armed self-defense tended to be informal and loosely organized by community activists and supporters from the 1950s through 1964 in Mississippi. After 1964, paramilitary groups with a specific chain of command and discipline emerged in some Mississippi communities and movement centers. The open advocacy of armed resistance and the abandonment of the rhetoric of nonviolence also became the common practice of movement spokespersons after 1964. I completed my dissertation titled Eye for an Eye, the Role of Armed Resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement in 1996. The question of armed resistance in the Southern black freedom struggle was underdeveloped in previous literature. Eye for an Eye and other works have turned the tide on the historiography of the civil rights movement with respect to the question of armed resistance in the Southern black freedom struggle. Historian Emily Crosby has pointed out the importance of local studies of the civil rights movement, revealing the role of armed self-defense in a way that was ignored by previous literature that emphasized a national top-down narrative. The book is We Will Shoot Back, Armed Resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement by Akanyele Omowale Umoja. Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. Welcome back to the third hour of our program, picking up your calls. And Lisa in Chicago. Hey, Lisa, what's up?
Hi.
Hey.
Tom, I've been trying to get a hold of you for a while, but I had this observation. I left Chicago and drove my dog down to be bred into almost to Mississippi, and I was still in Tennessee. But when I got down there, I noticed I thought I was in a farm area, and I couldn't find any fresh produce or anything like that was out in the, community. I just found fast food joints. And then I kind of noticed that everybody down there lives in a mobile home, but they don't own the mobile home. They're renting. And most of these mobile homes are just have huge amounts of piles of garbage and God knows what else outside of
So you were in an
mobile
area that was experiencing poverty, basically.
A lot of poverty. Yeah. And then everything is just fast food. So I'm thinking, this is a food desert, because I'm actually a nurse and I study psychology. But I got invited to, I kind of kept my mouth closed, but I got invited to a church down there. And it was Easter Sunday, and I got into the church, and I thought, okay, just keep your mouth closed, just watch what's going on, sit there. And I have gray hair and stuff, so I figured I'd just fit right in, and no one's going to look at me, And I had my jeans on. But I was listening to, they all of a sudden have this video of, Jesus dying on the cross, and I thought, okay, usual traditional, Christian, whatever story. And all of a sudden they're saying that another thing I noticed, thinking of the food desert, was all these people are sick. There's so many people sick. And this lady who I was breeding the dog with was talking about all her neighbors being sick and all her cousins being sick and cancer and all this stuff. And I kept thinking, it's probably the food, So then I'm in church and they're talking and they're showing this video, and it's extremely gruesome of Jesus dying, all the things they did to him and beat him and everything, and the blood and stuff. But then they start telling them, they're singing these songs, and they start saying that that they're going to all be reborn, and their bodies are going to come out of the graves, and the bones are going to be dancing and knocking together. And they sing this song about dancing bones. So I'm like, what the hell?
Yeah, this is the rapture.
I don't remember this in the Bible. So then all of a sudden the guy starts talking, the minister, and he starts saying that, we were a poor Baptist church, and now we have 76,000 churches together. And we're doing all this, we're making all this money. And I thought, and he said, we're helping people who are sick, and we're helping people feed people. And I'm thinking, and educate people. And none of these people are educated or fed or going to hospitals, and I'm thinking 76,000 churches together. And then I thought, there's 600 people in this church. That's hundreds of millions of people that they're affecting. And I thought, and I'm driving around and I'm seeing these signs, this judge, vote for this judge, he's pro-life. Vote for this judge, he's a Christian, whatever. Vote for this, sheriff. And I couldn't, I just...
So what's the point you're trying to get to here, Liza?
Well, the point is, it's literally, you guys are thinking that we're fighting like the Democratic or the Republican system, but they're using religion to fight, to keep a populace brainwashed to vote for them.
Yeah, this was the deal that the Reagan campaign made with Jerry Falwell and Billy Graham, and I think Jerry Falwell was the major, and Ralph Reed was...
And they have to be. I mean, if that many churches are involved in this, that means that all that money is going to campaign. It's not going to these poor people.
No, a lot of it is the churches themselves have become campaigns. They're starting to pitch candidates from the pulpit on a fairly regular basis. Liza, you've identified a very real problem in our society, and it's one, frankly, that I think we need to do something about. Thank you very much for the call. The number one thing that I would use to do something about it is end the tax exemption of churches. I'm all in favor of tax exemptions for monasteries, but not for churches. George in Chicago. Hey, George, what say you?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. Just briefly, as far as I'm concerned, the R in Republican has stood for racism since shortly after Nixon lost in 1960, and they started moving that direction with Goldwater. Nixon took his cue from the kind of tactics and strategy that Governor Wallace used and put it to work in 72. And whether it's out front and up front or subliminal and underplayed, the racist card is played regularly by the Republican Party and every Republican candidate, and has been ever since. And we can't deny what our eyes see and our ears hear. It is what it is.
Which raises the question, back to Yascha Mounk's book, is how can you have a truly pluralistic society, a functioning democracy, when one of the two political parties is openly pushing racism? How do you do that?
The other party just has to get up earlier, work harder, and work later. And
I think the answer to my semi-rhetorical question is you have to politically crush the other party. I mean, they have to be seen as the debris of a collapsed society, the way that we should have for the last 150 years viewed the Confederacy. But the whole lost cause thing and the Confederate memorials and all this other stuff, they kept and now on April 30th, they're doing a big thing on Stone Mountain. A bunch of white supremacists are getting together for a big nationwide celebration in front of Stone Mountain. The Southern Poverty Law Center is asking people to contact the people who run Stone Mountain and ask them not to invite these white supremacist racists to their for their annual event.
The fact that this kind of stuff is happening is why all honor and praise is due to President Biden for issuing a full presidential pardon to former Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden.
Amen.
He stood up for equal justice under the law and for just the basic concept.
In 1964, for God's sake, when it was 100 times harder than it is now.
And also, you and your partner, Lamar Waldron, deserve credit because you brought the case of Mr. Bolden to a larger public. I remember hearing your on-the-air interview with him, what was it, like 15 years ago?
More like 10 probably, but yeah, we've interviewed him a number of times, yeah.
Yes, and that was included in your books on the Kennedy assassination.
Yep.
It's also, from a personal standpoint, even though we're of different generations and different races, Mr. Bolden and I are both Southsiders from the great South Side of Chicago. And
so is my dad.
Because of your work, I got very interested in his case. I got my local library to buy his book and put it in the stacks. I bought a copy for myself, and I read everything I could find about Bolden and, contacted senators and congressmen and wrote to presidents and said, this guy deserves a pardon. I don't know if anybody heard my voice, but
I mean, that's what it takes. That's what it takes. Thank you.
Yeah, but the other thing to keep in mind is that he was prosecuted and persecuted into a horrendous imprisonment by a guy named Edward V. Hanrahan, who was the Democratic U.S. Attorney for the District of Northern Illinois at the time, and he was a total creature of Richard J. Daley and his machine.
Right.
And after Nixon took over, he was, of course, dismissed as U.S. Attorney, and he got elected Cook County State's Attorney, and he was the guy who caused the homicidal raid on the Black Panther headquarters in Chicago, where Mark Clark and Fred Hampton were murdered, and the police lied about what they did, and civil court cases eventually found out that they had blasted through the doors, firing 80 or 90 shots, and only one shot came back. And they claimed that shots that were made by the Panthers and showed them in pictures turned out to be nail heads. But the fact is that the same guy that railroaded Abraham Bolden into the cruel imprisonment he had to endure and the loss of his career was the same guy who made sure that the Black Panthers got broken and killed.
Wow.
So
I did not know that. Lamar probably does, but I did not know that.
Yeah.
Or I didn't remember that if I did know it at one point in time. That's an amazing story.
Anybody can just Google Edward V. Hanrahan or look him up on Wikipedia, and it tells you the basics of his story. And, of course, after that, his own career died. He couldn't get elected to anything anymore.
Yeah, and a fine thing that is. George, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing a little bit of history to the program. I appreciate it. And spot on about Abraham Bolden. And Lamar and I just busted our chops on that. We actually brought his case We brought this case to the attention of a number of major political figures, including Ted Kennedy back in the day. It was just so hard to get anything done.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It was like the whole power structure of the country was going, well, yeah, this guy was convicted. I mean, what's your problem? I'm so glad that this pardon was granted. And welcome back. Meredith in Walsenburg, Colorado. Hey, Meredith, what's on your mind?
Oh, you got it this time. I wanted to tell you that COVID is still alive and well, and that I was just exposed to it. I went to visit my mother. She's 95 years old, and my son was there, and his wife came over with her nephew. And he called me last night and told me that her nephew's whole family had COVID. And then he called me and told me his own wife had COVID.
Oh, my.
And now I have to go get tested for COVID this afternoon. So New Mexico's supposed to be clear of COVID. But guess what? Not happening.
Yeah. This new strain is just insanely contagious. I guess the question is it, seriously deadly? And if you're vaccinated and boosted and in good health, I guess that's the huge caveat. Apparently it's not a problem, but you've got, the number one doctor in America, Dr. Anthony Fauci, saying, I'm not going to go expose myself to this thing. And he's as vaccinated and boosted as you can get. So that causes me to think twice. Meredith, thanks for the status report, as it were, for the update from Colorado. David in Leadwood, Missouri. Hey, David, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, hey, Tom. There is a prejudice out there that affects all races, and it's whether you're yellow, brown, black, or white. And it goes unnoticed all the time, and it will beat you down. I was able to read by the age of 3 because my parents had money and could help me. But if you're born with a cleft palate, a hair lip, and a cleft palate, you not only have a visible thing, you have a thing where you can't talk properly, an impediment. It will hold you back from jobs. It will hold you down from jobs. It will even cause prejudice from teachers in schools.
So you're talking about a disability prejudice, essentially.
Yes, but it crosses the line of all races, and this is a thing that nobody really gives much merit to, the disability of people with hair lips. And I just wanted to bring this up because it will, if you go through life like this, you will not be prejudiced.
Are you speaking from personal experience, David?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I just wanted to bring that up. There aren't any organizations out there for this. And people, it really, as a child, it really hurts. Because I ended up being a street fighter because I got picked on so much. Wow. I thank you for letting me put this out there, Tom.
Yeah, my pleasure, David. Disability discrimination. I mean, there's a bunch of different kinds of discrimination that happen in our society that are just, horrible and unfair. Disabilities, obviously, race and religion, all those things. Being overweight. I mean, there's a bunch of, these where people just put people into categories in their brains and say, oh, that person must be because of, and it's so wrong. I'm sorry to hear, David, that it's been a tough life for you, and I'm glad to hear that you've made it through and that you're able to call in and say something positive here on the radio. Thank you.
Yes, for the other people.
There you go. Thank you, David. Nice to hear from you. We'll be back. It's 48 minutes past the hour. Stick around. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, helping you win the water cooler war. Are we getting back to the water cooler? Seems like we might be in a few months anyway. Stick around. Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann Program. And welcome back. Bill in Minneapolis. Hey, Bill, what's on your mind today?
I was just thinking it would be a brilliant move if the Democrats in Congress awarded Mike Pence the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Wow.
Think about it.
Wouldn't he first have to acknowledge that they tried to kill him?
Well, it'd be hard to deny. I mean, he stood up, made himself public enemy number one for all the Republicans, all the people storming that building. If there was one guy they wanted, it was him.
Yeah.
He was a target of President Trump. He's for the rest of his life, he's going to have a target on his back by MAGA supporters. There's no doubt.
Yeah.
What he did defended our country, and if it wasn't for him, who knows what would have happened. But the brilliant thing about it is that it'd be hard for Republicans not to vote for that. And then at the same time, by doing that, it's sort of acknowledging that it was an extremely dangerous event that they're trying to play down.
It would be a great example of basically forcing a vote, of forcing people to take a position. This is why, it's a similar idea to breaking out really popular things from legislation that couldn't get passed. Breaking out, for example, negotiating drugs, Medicare negotiating drug prices, and just running that as a standalone bill and saying, which side are you on here? And, I think your point has some merit, Bill. I'm ambivalent about giving awards to Republicans at all right now, including Mike Pence. But, maybe, I don't know. It's an interesting idea. Bill, thank you for the call. Nancy in Pocasset, Massachusetts. Hey, Nancy, what's up?
Yes, hi, Tom. I just wanted to say that somebody's already said it, but COVID is definitely alive and well. We attended a function for my brother-in-law. He was the first gay appellate. He was the first gay person onto the New York appellate court, and he passed away last year. We had an unveiling ceremony of his portrait, and 5 of us from my part of the family went to the event. And out of us, 3 of us got COVID. My brother and I were double vaccinated, and were lucky enough we did not get it. It had been 12 days since we got the shot. My sister ended up getting it because she had only been 3 days, and my brother-in-law has it as well. And the culprit, the one that betrayed us all, in my opinion, of course had it. But the PCR test, we all took them, and out of them, 3 of them were positive. Well, all of them were, let me put it this way. 1 showed positive, 4 showed negative. But my brother and sister-in-law, or my brother-in-law and sister, theirs ended up being positive because they did home tests. Yeah. So there are 2 PCR tests that aren't even recorded because they're doing them at home later on.
Yeah, and that's my point. When they're saying, okay, here the numbers are up 60%, those are the official numbers, and they do not include the home tests. And so I'm with you. Nancy, thank you. Thanks for sharing that story. It's fascinating times we live in. We really do. Harvey in Minneapolis. Hey, Harvey, what's on your mind today?
Hi, I'm a first-time caller.
Well, thank you, Harvey. What's up?
Dr. Fauci was on public radio this morning, and he was asked about the White House Correspondents' Dinner, why he wasn't going, and he gave 3 reasons. 1 is age because of lowered immune system. Some you might be at
But what's
risk.
his age? Isn't he just like 74, 75, something like that?
He's in his 70s. I don't know.
Is he Sean says he's over 80. Really? Okay.
That's possible.
Yeah. Okay. Anyhow, keep going, Harvey.
So he said we have a lowered immune system that when you get over a certain age, and he said that if you have health reasons for that you might be at risk, or you might bring it home to someone who is at risk. And he mainly said because of his age, he decided that.
Sean just checked; he's 81. So that I totally get it. But if you're going to have public health, it has to include everybody. It has to include people who are over 80. It has to include people who have, medical conditions, who are going through cancer treatments and things like that. I mean, essentially what he's saying is that he wouldn't fly. I mean, he hasn't come out and said this, but I mean, if he's not willing to expose himself at the Correspondents' Dinner, where else would he not expose himself? What else would he not do? And because of his age. So there you've got a condition. Harvey, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. JR in Miami. Hey, JR, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Thom. Can you hear me?
Sorta. There's a little road noise there, but you're listening on Sirius XM. I'm assuming you're driving with a Bluetooth.
Yeah, that's it. I turned it up. Can you hear me now?
That's fine, yeah. What's on your mind, JR?
Thom, I just got one simple question regarding Ukraine, and I'd love to hear your advice. There were three options, really, the way I see it, and I'm not very well versed in politics, and I thank God for that. One was go to war, knowing that you're never going to win the war. There would be thousands of people killed, maybe millions. That's one option, which apparently that's the one they decided to take. The other one was basically say, okay, Mr. Putin, here's the key, take over our country. And the third one was basically see if they could, basically slice the country in two halves, one Democratic and one Russia. Which one would you have done, Thom?
It's not my... if I were Ukrainian, I would say I want the whole damn country back. You have no right to be invading my country and taking pieces of it, and we're going to take the whole thing back. And as an American, my inclination is to support that kind of a position, JR. I realize that that's going to prolong things, but I also believe that Vladimir Putin is a person who only understands power. And if you don't punch him in the nose, he took a punch at Ukraine, and he has, his generals have declared that Moldova is next. And, and Russian state television right now is talking about taking the Baltic states in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. So I think that we are looking at a situation that's not that different from Hitler invading Poland in 1938, or 39, excuse me. So that's where I'm at, JR. Thanks a lot for the call. Charles in Coos Bay, Oregon. Charles, we have 1 minute left in the program. What's on your mind?
That's perfect, Tom. Thanks so much for what you do. I want to send out happy birthday greetings to the bicentennial boy, Ulysses Grant, born on this day in 1822.
Really?
Yes, indeed. And I want people to focus on the history that he left us, not so much what we know as general, but as president, his fierce defending of freed African Americans, his creating the Justice Department to defend the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and vigorously fighting the Ku Klux Klan, and also a visionary. He saw a world court in the future, and he saw a functioning biracial democracy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on all points, Charles. And Grant was an extraordinary man and struggled terribly with alcoholism and other things, but he was still an extraordinary man. Charles, thank you so much. And probably PTSD from being, a war general in Civil War. Just imagine. Thanks so much for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. So get out there, get active. Like President Zelensky, like Alexei Navalny says, get active. We'll see you tomorrow. Tag, you're it.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, how the death of privacy and the rise of surveillance threaten us and our democracy, by Thom Hartmann. More information at all book outlets. Wild Alaskan Company, 100% sustainable wild-caught seafood delivered right to your door. More info at wildalaskancompany.com/Tom. Cozy Earth, better sleep, better you. More info at cozyearth.com, promo code TOM. The latest views and opinions from U.S. politics and other fascinating subjects too, including cutting-edge science reports at HartmannReport.com. And Dinovite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at Dinovite.com.